He did not look like a man about to change the course of a war, and that was exactly why he did. In a conflict defined by loud personalities, public confidence, and aggressive bravado, Raymond Spruance commanded in near silence. He did not seek attention, he did not cultivate legend, and he did not confuse aggression with judgment. When the moment came that would decide the Pacific War, Spruance relied on something rarer than boldness. He relied on restraint. Spruance was not supposed to be there. He was a cruiser commander by training, a thinker rather than a showman. When circumstances suddenly placed him in command of America's carrier force at the most critical moment of the war, there was no time for adjustment, no margin for error, and no precedent to follow. The decisions he would make would echo across thousands of miles of ocean and across the rest of the war itself. Naval warfare in the Pacific was unlike anything before it. Battleships no longer ruled the sea. Distance mattered more than firepower. Information mattered more than visibility. Carrier combat meant commanders often fought without seeing the enemy, relying on fragmentary intelligence, radio intercepts, and instincts sharpened by discipline. In this environment, recklessness could be fatal, and hesitation could be just as dangerous. Spruance understood that balance. At Midway, he faced an enemy that had dominated the Pacific for months. Japanese naval aviation was experienced, confident, and deadly. The temptation was to chase, to strike again and again, to annihilate what remained. Spruance chose something harder. He chose control. He protected his carriers. He held his position. He denied the enemy opportunity. Those decisions, criticized by some at the time, preserved American naval power at the exact moment it mattered most. The enemy's strength was broken not by spectacle, but by patience executed under unimaginable pressure. From that point on, Spruance became the steady hand of the Pacific War. He commanded vast fleets across operations that spanned entire regions. He balanced risk and sustainability, understanding that victory would not come from one decisive battle alone, but from maintaining superiority across months and years of relentless campaigning. Unlike others, Spruance did not believe war rewarded constant pursuit. He believed it rewarded endurance. Under his command, naval aviation matured into a system, radar, fighter control, logistics, and coordination operating as one. Battles were won not only by pilots, but by preparation that extended far beyond the flight deck. Spruance also understood restraint as a moral responsibility. He avoided unnecessary risk to lives when objectives had already been achieved. He resisted pressure to chase glory at the cost of stability. He accepted criticism when it meant preserving the future of the fleet. By the end of the war, Spruance had commanded at the highest level without ever becoming a symbol. He remained composed, analytical, and deeply private. A commander whose influence was felt everywhere and seen almost nowhere. The history of Admiral Spruance is the story of leadership without spectacle, of decisions made quietly, of battles shaped by judgment rather than ego, of a war won not by who shouted loudest, but by who knew when enough was enough. He reminds us that in modern war, the most important choices are often the least visible, and that discipline can be more decisive than daring. Tonight, we return to that quiet command, to the maps and radio rooms, to the carrier decks stretching into the horizon, to the admiral who fought the Pacific War by thinking further ahead than his enemy. This is the history of Admiral Raymond Spruance. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it for you there? Is this a late-night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just to sit with history? And if these long, thoughtful journeys into the past help you slow down, focus, or appreciate leadership without noise, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you'd like to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the story of Admiral Spruance, June 4th, 1942, 0600 hours. The USS Enterprise pitches through dark Pacific swells 215 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. On the flag bridge, Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance stands motionless, hands clasped behind his back, staring at a tactical map illuminated by dim red light. Around him, staff officers shift nervously, glancing at watches, waiting for orders that refuse to come. The most important naval battle in American history will begin in the next 90 minutes, and the man who will decide its outcome has commanded aircraft carriers for exactly 48 hours. He says nothing. The silence stretches past uncomfortable into unbearable. The junior officers don't know what to make of him. Vice Admiral William Halsey, the charismatic warrior who should be standing here, lies in a Pearl Harbor hospital bed with a debilitating skin condition. In his place stands Halsey's cruiser commander, a methodical 55-year-old who has never led carriers in combat, never commanded aviation forces, never even qualified as a naval aviator. Captain Miles Browning, the brilliant but temperamental chief of staff, keeps clearing his throat, desperate to offer tactical advice. Commander Richard Gray, the operations officer, has intelligence reports in hand showing 4 Japanese carriers approaching from the northwest, their exact position uncertain by perhaps 40 miles. They need to launch aircraft soon or risk missing the enemy entirely. But Spruance remains silent, calculating variables no one else can see. His face reveals nothing. His reputation among these aviation officers is thin, built on competence in surface warfare, not the aggressive instincts they believe carrier combat demands. At 0630, a yeoman brings another position report. The Japanese carriers are launching aircraft to strike Midway Island itself, 150 miles away. Standard doctrine says wait for precise enemy coordinates before committing your strike force. Launch too early and your aircraft might search empty ocean until they run out of fuel. Launch too late and the enemy completes their attack, recovers their aircraft, and comes hunting for you with full strength. The window for optimal timing is perhaps 30 minutes wide. Spruance has been pacing the same 12-foot section of deck for 25 minutes, speaking to no one, his mind working through mathematics that will determine whether America holds the Pacific or loses it. The officers watch him with a mixture of hope and dread. Some wonder if he's frozen by the weight of command. Others recognize something different in his stillness, a quality they've never seen in Halsey's aggressive certainty. This is not paralysis. This is calculation operating at a level few minds can achieve. At 0700 hours, Spruance turns from the map. Launch immediately, he says, his voice carrying no drama, no inspiration, just flat operational clarity. All available aircraft. Maximum effort. The staff officers snap into motion, stunned by the suddenness after such prolonged silence. Browning starts to question the timing, concerned they're launching without confirmed target coordinates, but Spruance cuts him off with unusual sharpness. The enemy will be exactly where I calculate them to be at 0930. Our aircraft will need 2.5 hours to reach that position. We launch now. It's a statement that admits no debate. Within 6 minutes, flight deck crews are spotting the first dive bombers, their engines coughing to life in the pre-dawn darkness. By 0800, 67 aircraft from Enterprise, 49 from Hornet, are airborne and forming up in the gray morning light, flying toward coordinates based not on confirmed intelligence, but on one man's mathematical projection. Spruance has just committed 116 aircraft to attack an enemy whose exact location remains uncertain. He has stripped his carriers of defensive protection at the moment Japanese scouts might discover them. He has violated doctrine, ignored conventional wisdom, and bet the Pacific War on differential equations calculated in his head. What none of the officers around him understand yet is that Spruance has already won the battle, not through aggression or courage, though both will be required before the day ends, but through a form of strategic thinking the U.S. Navy has rarely seen at this level of command. While his staff worried about launching too early, Spruance calculated something far more complex. Japanese carriers would strike Midway, then recover their aircraft, refuel and rearm them, and only then be ready to launch against American carriers if they were discovered. That cycle would take approximately 2 hours. If American strike aircraft arrived during that vulnerable window, when Japanese flight decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, the damage would be catastrophic. But reaching that precise timing window required launching not when the enemy position was confirmed, but 90 minutes before confirmation could possibly arrive. It required trusting mathematics over experience, calculation over instinct, It required the intellectual confidence to be correct, when everyone around you believes you're guessing. The irony would have amused Spruance if he were given to irony. He was never supposed to be here. Palsy was the hero, the aggressive fighter, the admiral whose face appeared in American newspapers with reassuring regularity. Palsy represented everything the Navy publicly celebrated: offensive spirit, warrior instinct, the kind of charismatic leadership that inspired men to follow you into hell. Spruance represented something the Navy rarely acknowledged it needed: the capacity to think several moves ahead while chaos explodes around you. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1906, 25th in his class of 209, entirely unremarkable by the metrics that usually predict flag rank. He had spent more time in classrooms than most admirals, teaching at the Naval War College, studying logistics and strategy, while his peers sought glory in fleet exercises. He read constantly, maintaining a personal library of over 1,200 books on history, mathematics, and strategic theory. His contemporaries found him odd, too cerebral for a fighting service, uncomfortable at the social gatherings where careers were often made. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, saw something in Spruance that others missed. When Halsey collapsed with illness on May 26th, Nimitz faced an impossible choice. The Japanese were coming to Midway, their combined fleet representing the most powerful naval force ever assembled. American code breakers had provided priceless intelligence about enemy intentions, but intelligence means nothing without commanders capable of exploiting it. Nimitz had other carrier admirals available, men with aviation backgrounds, officers who seemed more naturally suited to the assignment. Instead, he chose the cruiser commander, the quiet intellectual, the man who calculated risks with mathematical precision. Nimitz gave Spruance one instruction that defined everything to follow: you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, not reckless aggression, not timid defense. Calculated risk. The phrase might have been invented specifically for Raymond Spruance. As Enterprise and Hornets aircraft disappear into the western sky, Spruance returns to his chart table. He knows what's coming, even if his staff doesn't fully grasp it yet. He has launched American torpedo bombers, obsolete TBD, devastator, slow and vulnerable, armed with torpedoes that frequently malfunction. These squadrons will reach the Japanese carriers first, flying low and slow, perfect targets for Japanese fighters. They will be slaughtered. Spruance knows this with near certainty, can calculate the probable loss rate with grim accuracy. But their sacrifice will pull Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the sky above clear for his dive bombers, which will arrive minutes later at high altitude. The torpedo squadrons are not expected to sink enemy carriers. They are expected to die while creating the conditions for dive bombers to succeed. It's a brutal calculus, one that would paralyze most commanders if they allowed themselves to contemplate it too directly. Spruance contemplates it, accepts it, and issues the orders anyway, because the mathematics of victory sometimes require accepting the mathematics of sacrifice. At 092, the radio crackles with frantic transmissions. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet has found the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, the reports become death cries. They got me. Diving in flames, tell my wife. 15 TBD Devastators go in against the combined fleet. 30 aircrew members. 14 aircraft are shot down. One returns to Hornet so badly damaged it will never fly again. 0 torpedo hits. One survivor, Ensign George Gay, floats in the ocean watching the battle continue around him. By 0950, all 3 American torpedo squadrons have attacked. 41 aircraft launched. 35 shot down. 6 limping back toward carriers they might not have fuel to reach. 0 torpedo hits. 0 carriers damaged. The staff officers on Enterprise Flag Bridge hear the radio transmissions and understand they are listening to men die. Some look at Spruance, wondering if he will show emotion, regret, anything. His face remains impassive. He expected this, planned for this. The horror they're hearing is part of his calculation. Terrible but necessary. At 10:22, everything changes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, has been searching for the Japanese carriers, flying on diminishing fuel, about to order his squadron to turn back before they lack the range to return home. Then he spots a Japanese destroyer wake, white against dark ocean, heading northeast, a single vessel racing to rejoin its fleet. McCluskey follows the wake. At 10:24, he sees them, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kada, Soryu, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled for the strike against American carriers. At 10:26, 37 American dive bombers roll into near-vertical dives. They are unopposed. Every Japanese fighter is still at sea level, where the torpedo bombers pulled them minutes earlier. In 4 minutes of bombing, 2 Japanese carriers are turned into floating funeral pyres. Yorktown's dive bombers hit Soryu simultaneously. By 10:30, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers at Midway are doomed, their hangars exploding, their crews abandoning ship. The battle isn't over, but its outcome is already determined. Spruance's calculation, made in silence before dawn, has proved devastatingly correct. The quiet man in the war room has just changed the course of the Pacific War through the purest application of strategic intellect over conventional wisdom. And he will do it again before the sun sets on this longest day. September 15th, 1926, the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Commander Raymond Spruance sits in a classroom that smells of chalk dust and old leather, surrounded by 30 other mid-career officers, all of them restless after years of sea duty. The instructor, Captain William Pye, is describing a theoretical war game, American carriers versus Japanese battleships in the Central Pacific. Most students are already mentally composing their aggressive solutions, imagining themselves as modern Nelsons bringing decisive battle to the enemy fleet. Spruance is doing something entirely different. He's calculating fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, logistics chains, the mathematical constraints that will determine what's actually possible versus what's merely dramatic. While his classmates dream of glory, Spruance is learning to think in systems, to see warfare not as a series of heroic encounters, but as a complex problem with variables that can be isolated, calculated, and controlled. This is where admirals were truly made in the interwar Navy, though few officers realized it. The Naval War College in the 1920s and 30s represented something unprecedented in American military education, a place where officers could fail without consequence, where aggressive instincts were subordinated to analytical thinking, where theoretical problems revealed truths that actual combat often obscured. Spruance had arrived at Newport as a competent but unremarkable destroyer captain, aged 40 with a career that seemed destined for respectable mediocrity. He had graduated from Annapolis in 1906 without particular distinction, served adequately in various assignments, demonstrated technical proficiency in gunnery and navigation. Nothing in his record suggested future greatness. But something happened to Spruance in those Newport classrooms, something that would eventually reshape American naval strategy, even though no one recognized it at the time. The transformation began with war games. The Naval War College used elaborate simulations, moving ship models across enormous floor maps, calculating engagement results using mathematical formulas that approximated real combat conditions. Most officers found the games tedious, preferring actual sea time to theoretical exercises. Spruance discovered he possessed an unusual gift for this artificial warfare. He could hold multiple variables in his mind simultaneously, projecting force movements several turns ahead, recognizing patterns that remained invisible to more conventional thinkers. In one memorable exercise, Spruance played the Japanese commander in a scenario eerily similar to Pearl Harbor. He proposed using carrier aircraft to strike American battleships at anchor, calculating that surprise would provide a brief window of absolute advantage before American carriers could respond. The year was 1927. His analysis predicted Pearl Harbor 14 years before it happened. His instructors noted his insight. Then they filed the exercise away and forgot about it, as peacetime militaries often do with uncomfortable prophecies. But Spruance didn't forget. He absorbed every lesson, read every recommended text, stayed late in the college library studying historical campaigns with the intensity most officers reserved for active operations. He became fascinated by Admiral Togo Heiichiro's victory at Tsushima. In 1905, particularly Togo's decision to maintain pursuit discipline after destroying the Russian Baltic Fleet, refusing to risk his victory by chasing scattered remnants into ambiguous night actions, the principle of protecting what you've won, of recognizing that sometimes restraint represents the highest form of strategic courage, that lesson burned into Spruance's consciousness. He studied Jutland, the Great War's only major fleet engagement, noting how Admiral Jellicoe's caution preserved British naval supremacy, despite critics who wanted aggressive pursuit. He read Mahan's theories about sea power, Clausewitz's principles of war, obscure analyses of logistics and industrial capacity that most naval officers found unbearably dull. His classmates thought him strange. The Naval War College attracted ambitious officers seeking the credential necessary for flag rank, but most treated it as an interruption to real service, a year to be endured before returning to ships. Spruance treated it as revelation. He filled notebooks with calculations, drew diagrams of optimal force deployments, questioned assumptions that most officers accepted as doctrine. When instructors proposed aggressive solutions to tactical problems, Spruance would quietly raise his hand and explain why fuel limitations or ammunition expenditure rates made those solutions mathematically impossible. He was not being contrarian. He genuinely couldn't understand why others didn't see the constraints he saw so clearly. His mind naturally parsed warfare into quantifiable variables, seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. It was a cognitive gift that made him occasionally awkward in social situations, the officer who would rather discuss logistics tonnages than trade sea stories at the officers' club. But it would prove invaluable when actual lives depended on actual calculations. After graduating from the Naval War College in 1927, Spruance returned to sea duty, commanding destroyers and cruisers with quiet competence. But he couldn't stop thinking like a wargamer. Every exercise became a problem to be solved through analysis. Every tactical decision was tested against the mathematical constraints of fuel, ammunition, time, and space. His fitness reports praised his technical proficiency while noting his reserved personality, his lack of the aggressive spirit traditionally associated with successful commanders. One superior officer wrote that Spruance was an excellent technician, but may lack the offensive qualities necessary for high command in wartime. The assessment was wrong in the most fundamental way possible, but it reflected the Navy's institutional bias toward visible aggression over invisible calculation. Spruance didn't argue. He never argued. He just continued refining his analytical approach, waiting for the moment when events would reveal which qualities actually mattered. That moment accelerated toward probability in the late 1930s. In 1938, the Navy sent Spruance back to the Naval War College, this time as an instructor. Now he taught the war games he had once played as a student, guiding new classes of officers through theoretical campaigns. The role suited him perfectly. He could articulate principles of calculated risk, explain how mathematical thinking could cut through the fog of war, demonstrate that strategic patience often achieved more than tactical aggression. Some students loved his teaching, recognizing insights that might save their lives in future combat. Others found him pedantic, too focused on logistics and constraints, insufficiently inspiring. Spruance didn't care about inspiration. He cared about correctness. He wanted officers who understood that most battles were won before the first shot through superior planning, better logistics, clearer thinking about what was actually possible versus what was merely dramatic. During this teaching tour, Spruance developed a close professional relationship with Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was then commanding a cruiser division. Nimitz recognized in Spruance a kindred intellect, someone who shared his belief that naval warfare required strategic thinking at least as much as warrior spirit. They spent hours discussing theoretical scenarios, testing ideas about carrier operations, debating the future of naval aviation. Nimitz was more personable than Spruance, better at the political dimensions of flag rank, but they shared a fundamental approach to warfare: meticulous planning, acceptance of calculated risk, willingness to make unpopular decisions based on mathematical probability rather than emotional impulse. When Nimitz later became Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, He would remember these conversations. He would remember the officer who could think several moves ahead, while others were still reacting to the present move. By 1941, as war with Japan became increasingly inevitable, Spruance had accumulated an unusual resume for a potential flag officer. He had spent 5 total years in various naval education roles, far more than most admirals. He had commanded destroyers and cruisers, but never battleships or carriers, the traditional stepping stones to high command. He had never sought publicity or political connections, the networking that often proved as important as tactical skill for career advancement. He maintained a personal library now exceeding 1,200 volumes, reading history and strategy with the dedication of an academic. His peers considered him competent but odd, brilliant in narrow ways but perhaps lacking the broader leadership qualities necessary for war. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. But first, the war would have to teach the Navy some brutal lessons about which leadership qualities actually mattered when your nation's survival depended on the decisions made by men under impossible pressure. When Pearl Harbor burned on December 7, 1941, Spruance was at sea commanding Cruiser Division 5, escorting the carrier Enterprise on a delivery mission. He missed the catastrophe by pure scheduling accident, returning to find the Pacific Fleet in ruins, and the Navy's institutional confidence shattered. In the chaos that followed as America scrambled to respond with damaged forces and shaken morale, Spruance began applying everything he had learned in those Newport classrooms. He trained his cruiser crews in anti-aircraft coordination, drilled them in damage control procedures, calculated optimal defensive formations for protecting carriers. He watched other admirals react to Pearl Harbor with either paralysis or reckless aggression, 2 extremes that both reflected emotional response rather than analytical thinking. Spruance offered a third way: calculated risk. Plan meticulously. Accept uncertainty. Make decisions based on probability rather than certainty. Protect what you have while looking for genuine opportunities to inflict disproportionate damage. It was everything the Naval War College had taught him, everything his unusual mind had refined through years of theoretical study. Now he would have the opportunity to test whether classroom brilliance could translate into actual victory. The quiet man who preferred books to battle cries was about to prove that sometimes the most revolutionary leadership comes from the most unexpected sources. March 7, 1941. The heavy cruiser USS Northampton plows through moderate Pacific swells during fleet exercises off Hawaii. On the flag bridge, newly promoted Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance observes a simulated air attack, studying how his cruiser formation maneuvers to protect the carrier Lexington. The scenario is theoretical, but Spruance treats it with absolute seriousness, timing each defensive movement, calculating firing solutions, noting gaps in anti-aircraft coverage. A young ensign, fresh from the academy, watches the admiral with confusion. Most flag officers observe exercises from a distance, trusting subordinates to handle tactical details. Spruance is using a stopwatch, measuring how long each cruiser takes to reach optimal anti-aircraft positions. When the exercise concludes, he calls his cruiser captains to conference and presents them with 17 specific observations about timing inefficiencies and formation weaknesses. The captains glance at each other, uncertain whether to be impressed or intimidated by this level of analytical attention. This was Spruance's unexpected gift to the carrier war that was coming. He understood surface warfare in ways that aviation admirals did not. The Navy had split itself into tribal camps by the late 1930s, battleship officers versus carrier advocates, black shoes who wore black shoes with their dress uniforms versus brown shoes who wore brown aviation footgear. The division went deeper than footwear. It represented fundamentally different views about naval warfare's future. Carrier admirals believed aviation had made surface ships obsolete. Battleship admirals clung to gunpowder and armor. Cruiser and destroyer officers like Spruance occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, operating the screening vessels that protected larger ships, intimate with the practical details of coordination between air and surface forces. When Spruance was given Cruiser Division 5 in 1941, he inherited command of heavy cruisers Northampton and Salt Lake City, powerful vessels designed to protect carriers from surface threats. He would spend the next year learning how to make that protection effective, accumulating tactical knowledge that would prove invaluable when he needed to defend carriers, while simultaneously launching strikes. His timing was accidentally perfect. The Navy was rapidly expanding its carrier force, building new Essex-class carriers, training new air groups, struggling to develop doctrine for a form of warfare that remained largely theoretical. Spruance's cruiser division spent the spring and summer of 1941 escorting carriers during exercises, working out coordination problems, testing communication procedures, discovering through trial and error how surface ships and aircraft could function as integrated systems. Most admirals found this work tedious, preferring the dramatic moments of simulated combat to the grinding details of logistics and coordination. Spruance loved the details. He calculated optimal cruiser speeds for maintaining position while maximizing fuel efficiency. He developed firing tables for anti-aircraft guns at various aircraft approach angles. He drilled his crews in damage control procedures until they could seal compartments and restore systems in minutes rather than hours. In November 1941, Spruance was at sea escorting Enterprise during the weeks before Pearl Harbor, his cruisers practicing the screening formations he had designed. On December 7th, he was 300 miles west of Oahu when the Japanese struck. His task force raced toward Pearl Harbor at maximum speed, but arrived too late to effect anything except the rescue operations. Standing on Northampton's bridge, watching the harbor burn, Spruance experienced the same shock that stunned the entire Navy. But underneath the shock, his analytical mind was already processing tactical lessons. The Japanese had demonstrated that carrier aircraft could achieve complete surprise and devastating effect. Their attack had been precisely timed, perfectly coordinated, ruthlessly efficient. They had not lingered after the attack, had not exposed their carriers to counterattack, had preserved their strength for future operations. It was exactly the kind of calculated aggression Spruance had studied at the Naval War College. The enemy had just validated every principle he believed about carrier warfare. Strike hard, strike first, then protect your striking power for the next battle. In the chaotic months after Pearl Harbor, Spruance's cruiser division became part of Vice Admiral William Halsey's task force, screening Enterprise and the new carrier Hornet through the early raids that boosted American morale. Spruance observed Halsey closely during this period, learning both what to emulate and what to avoid. Halsey was everything the American public wanted in a wartime admiral: aggressive, quotable, personally brave, willing to take risks that made newspaper headlines. He raided Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls and Gilberts, struck at Wake Island, escorted Doolittle's bombers to their famous raid on Tokyo. Each operation lifted American spirits while teaching the Navy painful lessons about carrier operations under combat conditions. Spruance watched and learned. He noticed that Halsey's aggressive instincts sometimes put task forces at unnecessary risk, pursuing targets after surprise was lost, lingering in dangerous waters for psychological effect rather than military necessity. He saw Halsey's staff struggle to coordinate complex operations, the admiral's charismatic leadership sometimes creating confusion when subordinates weren't sure whether aggressive directives meant calculated risk or reckless exposure. But Spruance also recognized Halsey's strengths. The man inspired loyalty through personal connection, could motivate exhausted crews through sheer force of personality, understood that morale sometimes mattered as much as tactics. Where Spruance was reserved and analytical, Halsey was emotional and intuitive. Where Spruance planned meticulously, Halsey adapted aggressively. They represented two different approaches to naval command, and Spruance had the wisdom to recognize that both approaches had value. He never criticized Halsey, never questioned his decisions publicly, maintained the professional relationship that would later allow Nimitz to rotate them in command of the same fleet. But privately, in his cabin aboard Northampton, Spruance was developing his own philosophy of carrier warfare, one that would differ from Halsey's in crucial ways. By May 1942, Spruance had become the Navy's invisible expert on carrier escort. He had spent 8 months protecting Enterprise and Hornet through combat operations, longer continuous experience screening carriers than any other flag officer. He understood carrier vulnerabilities better than most aviation admirals. He knew how long it took to launch a full strike, how vulnerable carriers were during recovery operations, how far escorts needed to maintain position to provide effective anti-aircraft fire without interfering with flight operations. He had calculated fuel consumption rates at various speeds, knew exactly how far task forces could operate before requiring underway replenishment. He had studied Japanese tactics through combat reports, noting their doctrine of sequential strikes, their tendency to commit forces gradually rather than in overwhelming mass. This was not glamorous knowledge. No newspaper reporters interviewed him about carrier doctrine. But it was the kind of practical expertise that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat when the decisive moment arrived. That moment came with shocking suddenness. On May 26, 1942, Halsey collapsed with severe dermatitis, hospitalized and unable to command during the most critical operation in the Pacific War. Admiral Nimitz faced an impossible choice. The Japanese were coming to Midway with the combined fleet, 4 heavy carriers, battleships, cruisers, the most powerful naval force ever assembled. American codebreakers had provided warning, but warning meant nothing without commanders capable of exploiting it. Nimitz had other aviation admirals available, officers with brown shoe credentials, men who seemed more naturally suited to commanding carriers. Instead, he chose the cruiser admiral, the black shoe officer with 8 months of carrier escort experience, but no aviation background. Some staff officers at Pearl Harbor questioned the decision. They needn't have worried. Nimitz recognized what they couldn't see. Spruance had been studying for this examination for 16 years, ever since those first war games at Newport. The quiet man who calculated anti-aircraft firing solutions with stopwatches was about to demonstrate that sometimes the best preparation for revolutionary warfare comes from understanding its fundamental constraints rather than its dramatic possibilities. On May 28th, Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor with Spruance aboard as task force commander. He brought with him everything he had learned, the Naval War College principles of calculated risk, his surface warfare expertise in coordinating complex formations, his 8 months of practical experience screening carriers, his analytical approach to tactical problems. He also brought something less tangible but equally important, the confidence to think differently than everyone around him. Halsey had given him parting advice to go in and strike hard, classic aggressive counsel. Spruance listened politely, thanked Halsey for his guidance, and then proceeded to develop a completely different operational plan based not on striking hard, but on striking smart. He would not seek battle for its own sake. He would position his carriers to achieve maximum surprise at minimum risk. He would launch when mathematics dictated optimal timing, not when conventional wisdom suggested it was time to be aggressive. He would protect his striking power even after achieving victory, understanding that the war would continue far beyond any single battle. These principles would guide his decisions at Midway and define his entire approach to naval command. They represented something the Navy desperately needed, but rarely celebrated: the triumph of strategic intellect over tactical instinct, the patient calculation that wins wars even when it doesn't make inspiring headlines. May 26, 1942, 1400 hours, Pearl Harbor Submarine Base. Admiral Chester Nimitz's temporary headquarters occupies a building still smelling of fresh paint and welding fumes, the permanent headquarters having been moved inland after the December attack. Raymond Spruance enters through a heavily guarded entrance, summoned by urgent dispatch while his cruisers refuel at Ford Island. He expects routine operational briefing. Instead, Nimitz looks up from a desk covered in intelligence reports and delivers words that will change Spruance's life. Admiral Halsey is hospitalized. You're taking command of Task Force 16. The room goes silent. Nimitz's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, glances sharply at his commander, clearly surprised by the decision. Spruance feels his stomach drop, but his face remains characteristically impassive. "When do we sail, sir?" "Day after tomorrow. The Japanese are coming to Midway with everything they have. This will be the decisive battle of the Pacific War, and you're going to fight it." The next 48 hours would reveal whether 16 years of theoretical study could compress into practical mastery under impossible time pressure. Spruance left Nimitz's headquarters with a leather folder containing code-breaking intelligence that read like fantasy. The Japanese would strike Midway on June 4th with 4 heavy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, supported by battleships and cruisers, the most powerful naval task force ever assembled. Their objective was to seize Midway and draw the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement where Japanese superiority in carriers and battleships would prove overwhelming. The plan was elegant, aggressive, and fatally assumed the Americans would react defensively, exactly as they had reacted to every Japanese move since Pearl Harbor. What the plan didn't account for was that the Americans had broken Japanese naval codes, knew the attack was coming, and had time to prepare an ambush. What it especially didn't account for was that the admiral commanding that ambush would be a man who thought in terms of geometric probability rather than warrior instinct. Spruance's first action revealed his methodical nature. Rather than immediately heading to Enterprise to assume command, he spent 3 hours at submarine base headquarters reading every intelligence report, every code intercept, every analysis of Japanese intentions. He studied aircraft performance data, carrier capabilities, typical Japanese operational patterns. He asked Captain Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, dozens of detailed questions. What time would Japanese carriers launch their Midway strike? How long would it take them to recover and rearm aircraft for a second strike? What was their usual combat air patrol strength? What range did their search aircraft typically cover? Layton had briefed dozens of flag officers. None had asked such technically specific questions. Spruance was not interested in motivational briefings or strategic overviews. He wanted data. He wanted numbers. He wanted the raw material for the calculations he was already running in his head. At 1800 hours, Spruance finally boarded Enterprise at Ford Island. The carrier was a city afloat, over 2,000 officers and men, 83 aircraft, a massive floating machine dedicated to projecting air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. Spruance had never commanded anything remotely this complex. His flag cabin was cramped, dominated by a large plotting table where he could spread charts and tactical diagrams. His staff assembled for their first meeting. Captain Miles Browning, Chief of Staff. Brilliant at aviation tactics but volatile and difficult. Commander Richard Gray, Operations Officer, competent but unimaginative. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Air Group Commander, experienced pilot with good tactical instincts. They regarded their new admiral with barely concealed skepticism, a black shoe commanding brown shoe forces, an untested carrier commander facing the combined fleet. Their professional courtesy masked profound doubt. Spruance understood their skepticism and chose not to address it. He would prove himself through results, not reassurances. He spent the evening meeting with department heads, asking technical questions that surprised them with their specificity. How long did it take to launch a full strike? What were fuel consumption rates at various speeds? How many aircraft could be maintained on deck alert? What was the minimum arming time for torpedoes versus bombs? The officers answered somewhat defensively, uncertain whether Spruance was testing them or genuinely didn't know carrier operations. The truth was both. He was absorbing a crash course in carrier aviation while simultaneously probing for tactical parameters he would need for his calculations. By midnight, his head hurt from information overload. His cabin desk was covered in notes, diagrams, fuel calculations, range circles drawn with a compass. May 27th became the longest workday of Spruance's career to that point. At 0500, he was awake studying aircraft performance specifications. At 0700, he attended flight operations, watching the intricate choreography of launching and recovering aircraft, timing each phase with his ever-present stopwatch. At 0900, he conferred with Nimitz at SIN, PAC headquarters, receiving final intelligence updates and operational authority. Nimitz's instructions were both empowering and terrifying. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy. In other words, don't lose the carriers. They represented the entire American striking power in the Pacific. But also, take risks when the mathematics favor success. Nimitz was giving Spruance permission to think rather than merely follow doctrine. The afternoon of May 27th, Spruance visited Halsey in the Naval Hospital. He found the aggressive admiral in a private room, covered in angry red welts, frustrated beyond measure at missing the war's biggest battle. Halsey's advice was characteristically direct. Go in there and strike hard. Give them everything you've got. If you find Japanese carriers, don't worry about anything else. Just strike hard and keep striking. Spruance listened carefully, thanked Halsey genuinely, and filed the advice under consider but don't necessarily follow. He understood that Halsey's aggressive instincts had value, but he also recognized that his own analytical approach might prove more effective in this particular situation. He was developing a battle plan that would strike hard, but would also preserve striking power, accepting calculated risk but not reckless exposure. It was a subtle but crucial difference. That evening, Spruance held his second staff meeting, this time laying out his operational concept. He would coordinate with Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would arrive with Carrier Yorktown as overall tactical commander. Fletcher outranked Spruance but had less recent carrier experience. Nimitz had instructed them to cooperate flexibly, avoiding rigid command hierarchy. Spruance proposed a decentralized approach. Fletcher would handle tactical decisions for Task Force 17. Spruance would handle Task Force 16. Both would maintain position to support each other while allowing individual initiative. It was innovative command doctrine, trusting subordinates to execute intent rather than orders. The kind of approach that could fail catastrophically or succeed brilliantly depending on the people involved. Spruance was betting that flexibility would prove more valuable than rigid control when the battle developed. The final day before sailing, May 28th, became a whirlwind of last-minute preparations. Enterprise and Hornet took on final supplies, ammunition, fuel. Air groups flew aboard, flight decks suddenly crowded with dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters. Spruance spent the morning in his cabin doing what everyone else thought was impossible, planning a carrier battle with less than 2 days of carrier command experience. He drew range circles on charts, calculated intercept geometries, studied Japanese operational patterns from intelligence reports. The central insight came sometime mid-morning, a realization that would shape his entire Midway plan. Japanese carriers would be vulnerable during a specific window, after launching their Midway strike but before recovering those aircraft and launching against American carriers. That window was perhaps 90 minutes long. Missing it meant attacking Japanese carriers at full strength. Hitting it meant catching them with crowded flight decks, armed aircraft, fuel lines open, maximum vulnerability. But hitting that window required knowing where the Japanese carriers would be, and launching American strikes before that position was confirmed. It required acting on probability rather than certainty. At 0600 on May 28th, Enterprise and Hornet sortied from Pearl Harbor, turning north and then northwest toward the expected interception point northeast of Midway. Spruance stood on the flag bridge as Ford Island disappeared astern, feeling the weight of command settle onto his shoulders like physical pressure. He commanded 2 carriers, 8 supporting ships, 233 aircraft, approximately 12,000 men. He was sailing to meet 4 Japanese carriers, probably supported by battleships and cruisers, the most powerful fleet ever assembled by the Imperial Navy. He had been preparing for this moment for 48 hours, or perhaps for 16 years since those first war games at Newport. The education of a different kind of admiral was about to face its final examination. The grade would be measured not in academic scores, but in ships sunk, lives lost, strategic advantage gained or squandered. The quiet man who preferred calculations to courage had run out of time to prepare. Now he could only execute what he had planned, and hope his mathematics proved correct when tested by actual combat. June 2nd, 1942, 2200 hours. Point Luck, the designated rendezvous coordinates 325 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. The USS Enterprise and Hornet from Task Force 16 merge with USS Yorktown from Task Force 17. Under darkness, 3 American carriers now positioned across the path of the approaching Japanese combined fleet. In the flag plot aboard Enterprise, Raymond Spruance spreads reconnaissance charts across the plotting table, studying them under red light that won't compromise his night vision. Around him, staff officers discuss final preparations with the nervous energy of men approaching battle. Spruance ignores the chatter, his mind running through calculations that will determine whether America holds the Pacific or loses it. His hand moves across the chart with a pencil, drawing circles, measuring distances, calculating time-distance problems with the precision of an artillery officer plotting firing solutions. The mathematics of carrier warfare were brutally simple in concept, but wickedly complex in execution. Aircraft had maximum combat radius limited by fuel capacity and operational endurance. Dauntless dive bombers could reach approximately 175 miles in combat configuration, operate for perhaps 4 hours before fuel exhaustion forced emergency landings. Devastator torpedo bombers had slightly less range, about 150 miles practically, though theoretical specifications claimed more. Wildcat fighters, tasked with defending the strike package and providing combat air patrol over carriers, could operate about 150 miles out for roughly 2.5 hours. These ranges created a geometric problem. Carriers had to position themselves close enough to strike the enemy, but far enough to avoid being easily located by enemy scouts. Too close, and you lost tactical surprise. Too far, and your aircraft ran out of fuel before completing the mission or returning home. The optimal solution was a narrow envelope of distance and timing that maximized strike effectiveness while minimizing risk to the carriers. Spruance had spent the past 2 days calculating that optimal envelope with obsessive precision. He knew from intelligence reports that Japanese carriers would launch their Midway attack at approximately 0430 on June 4th, probably from about 240 miles northwest of the atoll. After striking Midway, those carriers would need to recover aircraft, refuel, and rearm them for a second strike against American carriers if they were discovered. The recovery and rearming cycle would take approximately 2 hours, maybe slightly less if Japanese deck crews worked with perfect efficiency. During that window, Japanese flight decks would be crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, maximum vulnerability to attack. But American carriers were currently positioned about 260 miles from the Japanese anticipated position, too far for effective strike with comfortable fuel margins. Spruance needed to close the distance overnight without being detected by Japanese submarines or air scouts. At midnight, Spruance made his first crucial decision. Task Forces 16 and 17 would steam southwest at 15 knots through the darkness, closing the distance to the Japanese fleet while remaining beyond their probable search radius. 15 knots was carefully calculated, fast enough to shorten strike range by perhaps 30 miles by dawn, slow enough to conserve fuel for the higher speeds that would be necessary during actual battle. It was the kind of decision that revealed Spruance's thinking. Every choice optimized for mathematical efficiency, balancing multiple variables simultaneously. His staff officers proposed 18 knots, arguing for faster closure. Spruance overruled them. The fuel expenditure didn't justify the marginal improvement in strike range, and higher speeds increased the chance of detection by Japanese submarines. This was not timidity. This was optimization. June 3rd passed intense preparation. American carrier task forces maintained position northeast of Midway, while Army Air Force B, 17 bombers flying from Midway made contact with Japanese transport forces approaching from the west. The contacts weren't the carriers, just the invasion force, but they confirmed the enemy was coming exactly as intelligence predicted. Spruance spent the afternoon in repeated conferences with his staff, wargaming scenarios, testing contingencies. Captain Browning, his chief of staff, grew increasingly frustrated with Spruance's methodical approach, wanting to steam west aggressively, close the distance, find the enemy carriers through aggressive scouting. Spruance refused. Aggressive scouting revealed your own position. The Japanese didn't know American carriers were nearby. That ignorance was the most valuable asset Spruance possessed, worth more than any intelligence about exact enemy positions. As afternoon became evening, Spruance finalized his operational plan with geometric precision. He would position his task force approximately 200 miles north-northeast of the anticipated Japanese carrier position at dawn. From there, he would launch strikes at maximum effective range as soon as enemy carriers were located. Maximum range meant greater risk of fuel exhaustion for returning aircraft. But it also meant achieving surprise when Japanese combat air patrol was concentrated low altitude after their Midway strike. The key variable was timing. Launch too early, and aircraft might not find the enemy. Launch too late and miss the vulnerable window when Japanese decks were crowded with armed aircraft. Spruance calculated the optimal launch time as approximately 0700 hours on June 4th, assuming Japanese carriers were located within a 40-mile uncertainty radius of their predicted position. That evening, Spruance composed operational orders that his staff would later recognize as masterpieces of clarity. He wrote, "Task Force 16 will strike enemy carriers as soon as located, employing maximum aircraft strength. Attack will be coordinated with Task Force 17 attacks to achieve overwhelming concentration. Objectives in order of priority: enemy carriers, supporting vessels only if carriers are destroyed or disabled. After striking, Task Force 16 will retire eastward to avoid engagement with superior enemy surface forces." The orders were simple, clear, and embedded with strategic insight. Carriers were the priority because they represented striking power. Supporting vessels could be hunted later. Retirement eastward after attacking would open range between American carriers and Japanese battleships, preventing the surface engagement where Japanese superiority would prove decisive. Every sentence reflected calculated thought about the battle's strategic purpose beyond merely sinking ships. After finishing the orders, Spruance did something that surprised his staff. He went to sleep. It was 2100 hours on June 3rd, probably 9 hours before battle would begin, and the admiral commanding the most important American naval operation of the war simply went to his cabin and slept. Captain Browning was stunned, wanted to wake him for continued planning. Commander Gray stopped him. "The admiral has made his calculations. Now he's conserving energy for tomorrow." It was exactly correct analysis. Spruance understood that exhausted commanders made poor decisions under stress. He had done the intellectual work. The battle would test his calculations, but additional worrying would not improve them. Sleep was operationally optimal, so he slept while his staff stayed awake fretting, another small example of his unusual command philosophy. June 4th began at 0500 with reports from Midway's patrol aircraft. At 0530, a PBY Catalina spotted Japanese carriers 200 miles to the northwest, approximately where Spruance calculated they would be. The position report was imprecise, with perhaps a 40-mile uncertainty radius, but it was close enough. Spruance was on the flag bridge within minutes, fully alert, already running calculations. Japanese carriers were launching their Midway strike. That meant American strikes launched now would arrive while Japanese decks were recovering and rearming aircraft. Perfect timing. But the 40-mile position uncertainty troubled him. Standard doctrine said wait for more precise coordinates before launching. Spruance calculated something different. Waiting would cost 60 to 90 minutes, moving outside the optimal attack window. Launching immediately with imprecise coordinates risked his aircraft searching for the enemy and perhaps not finding them before fuel exhaustion forced returns. But the mathematics favored launching now. His air groups would fly to the projected position, and even with 40-mile uncertainty, search patterns would probably locate the enemy carriers within the fuel endurance envelope. At 0600, Spruance made the decision that would win the Battle of Midway before the battle properly began. Launch immediately. All available aircraft, full strike. His staff officers looked at him with shock. They were launching with incomplete intelligence, committing everything based on a position estimate that might be wrong. Captain Browning started to argue. Spruance cut him off with unusual sharpness. "The enemy will be where I calculate them to be at 0930. Our aircraft will need approximately 2.5 hours to reach that position. We launch now or we miss the attack window. Execute the order." The tone left no room for debate. Within minutes, flight deck crews were spotting aircraft, engines coughing to life, the organized chaos of launching a full carrier strike beginning in the gray morning light. Spruance's mathematics of destruction was about to face its ultimate test against the chaos of actual combat. June 4, 1940 to 0700 hours. The flight deck of USS Enterprise tilts into the wind, the carrier heeling slightly as it turns to launch heading. Aviation crews in color-coded jerseys swarm around aircraft, making final checks, pulling wheel chocks, guiding pilots through startup procedures. In the ready rooms below, squadron commanders brief final attack plans, voices tense with the knowledge they're about to fly the most important mission any of them will ever face. On the flag bridge, Raymond Spruance watches the launch operations with his characteristic calm, but his fingers grip the bridge railing tightly, the only visible sign of the pressure he feels. He has just ordered 116 aircraft from Task Force 16 Airborne, based on intelligence that could be wrong by 40 miles or more. He is betting the Pacific War on differential equations calculated in his head. The launch sequence revealed the intricate choreography required to convert a stationary carrier into a mobile airfield, projecting power across hundreds of miles. Fighters launched first, Grumman Wildcats accelerating down the flight deck, their radial engines roaring at full power, lifting off and circling to establish combat air patrol over the task force. Next came dive bombers, Douglas Dauntlesses loaded with 1,000-pound bombs, heavier and slower, requiring longer takeoff rolls, their crews of pilot and rear gunner visible in open cockpits. Finally, torpedo bombers, obsolete Douglas Devastators, carrying Mark 13 torpedoes that everyone knew were unreliable, but represented the only weapon capable of hitting ships below the waterline. Each aircraft type had different performance characteristics, different fuel consumption, different operational endurance. Coordinating them into an effective strike package required precise timing and communications. Spruance had studied these details for weeks, but studying was very different from executing under combat pressure with lives at stake. By 0700, Enterprise and Hornet had launched 67 dive bombers, 29 torpedo bombers, 20 fighters. From Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher launched an additional strike, 17 dive bombers, 12 torpedo planes, 6 fighters. Total American strike power converging on the expected Japanese position. 116 aircraft carrying approximately 70 tons of bombs and torpedoes. It was the largest carrier strike ever launched by the United States Navy, and it was flying toward coordinates that were estimates rather than confirmed positions. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, formed up his dive bombers at 14,000 feet, looked back at the long string of aircraft following him, and felt the weight of impossible responsibility. He had been given a set of coordinates, told the enemy would probably be within 40 miles of that position, and ordered to find and destroy 4 Japanese carriers. The entire American position in the Pacific depended on his success in the next 3 hours. As the strike aircraft droned westward into the brightening morning, Spruance faced an agonizing weight. He had committed his entire striking power to an attack based on mathematical projection. His carriers were now stripped of most defensive aircraft, vulnerable if Japanese scouts discovered them. He couldn't recall the strike. Radio silence was essential to prevent Japanese direction finding from locating his task force. He could only wait and trust that his calculations were correct, that his air crews would execute their missions effectively, that the variables he couldn't control wouldn't prove decisive. It was the most uncomfortable position for a man who thought in terms of quantifiable risk. The moment when calculation ended and faith began. At 0815, 45 minutes after Enterprise launched its final aircraft, a Japanese scout aircraft spotted Task Force 17. The contact report was fragmentary, unclear about American carrier strength, but it alerted the Japanese that American carriers were nearby. Spruance listened to the intercepted Japanese radio transmission and felt his stomach tighten. His mathematical window was narrowing. Japanese carriers would now begin preparing strikes against American forces. The question was whether Spruance's strikes would arrive before Japanese strikes launched. It became a race measured in minutes, with perhaps 1,000 American lives hanging on the outcome of timing calculations made hours earlier. On Midway itself, Army, Navy, and Marine aircraft were launching their own attacks against the Japanese carriers. B-17 bombers flying from high altitude, Marine dive bombers and obsolete Vindicator aircraft, Navy torpedo planes, and equally obsolete TBF Avengers. These attacks were brave and doomed. The Midway-based aircraft had minimal coordination, attacked piecemeal, faced overwhelming Japanese fighter opposition. They achieved no hits. They died by dozens. But unknowingly, they were performing a crucial function. They were forcing Japanese carriers to maneuver evasively, to maintain combat air patrol at high strength, to delay the rearming cycle that would have prepared them to strike American carriers. Spruance's strikes were still 90 miles out, perhaps 35 minutes from reaching the target area. The Midway attacks were buying time measured in minutes, though the pilots dying in those attacks didn't know they were part of a larger operational picture. At 0900, the first American carrier aircraft reached the expected Japanese position and found empty ocean. Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, stared down at water sparkling in morning sunlight and felt the cold rush of fear that he had somehow failed, that the intelligence was wrong, that he would have to return to Enterprise and report the most catastrophic reconnaissance failure in naval history. His fuel gauge showed consumption slightly higher than planned. At current rates, he had perhaps 90 minutes before forced landing became inevitable. Standard doctrine said turn back now, preserve the aircraft and crews for future operations. McCluskey made a different calculation. Spruance had launched based on mathematical projection of where the Japanese would be. The projection was probably correct, but the timing might be slightly off. The Japanese carriers were here somewhere. He would search rather than retreat. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, made a similar calculation from a different direction. His squadron had separated from the rest of Hornet's air group through navigation error or deliberate choice. The historical record remains unclear. At 0920, Waldron spotted smoke on the horizon and turned his 15 TBD Devastators toward it. He had found the Japanese carriers purely by chance or perhaps by instinct born of years studying Japanese operational patterns. What he found was nightmare. 4 carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled, surrounded by screening battleships and cruisers, covered by 50 or more Zero fighters. Waldron's obsolete torpedo bombers were slow, underarmed, virtually defenseless against fighters. He transmitted one message: "We will attack. We will go in." Then he led his squadron into the most one-sided slaughter in naval aviation history. The next 40 minutes became a nightmare replay of failed American torpedo attacks. Waldron's Squadron 8 attacked first at 092. All 15 aircraft were shot down. 30 crew members died in flames. One survived, Ensign George Gay, floating in his life vest watching the battle continue around him. At 0940, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked with 14 aircraft. 10 were shot down, 4 limped back to the carrier so badly damaged they would never fly again. At 1000, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked with 12 aircraft. 10 shot down, 2 barely returned. In 40 minutes, American torpedo squadrons launched 41 aircraft against the Japanese carriers. 35 were destroyed. The survivors shot up, crews wounded, aircraft riddled with cannon holes. They achieved 0 torpedo hits, 0 carriers damaged. It appeared to be a catastrophic American defeat, a sacrifice of brave men for absolutely no tactical gain. What the dying torpedo pilots couldn't see was that they were pulling the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top altitude, 50 Zero fighters focusing on slaughtering the slow torpedo bombers, leaving the sky above virtually undefended. Wade McCluskey's dive bombers were at 14,000 feet, 70 miles away, still searching, still having not found the Japanese fleet, but they were about to. At 10:19, McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer wake, white against dark ocean, a single vessel racing northeast. He understood instantly. The destroyer had been depth charging an American submarine, now returning to the main fleet. Follow that wake and he would find the carriers. At 10:22, he saw them. 4 carriers, exactly where Spruance calculated they would be, but 40 minutes later than Spruance's timing projection. The delay meant nothing now. Below him, Japanese carriers were recovering aircraft from the Midway strike, their decks crowded with planes, fuel lines snaking across steel decks, ordnance handlers wheeling bombs and torpedoes, maximum vulnerability. McCluskey's radio crackled, all available aircraft push over and attack. At 10:25, 37 dauntless dives from 14,000 feet. Spruance's mathematics of destruction was about to become reality. The long launch was about to justify every risk the quiet admiral had calculated in the darkness before dawn. June 4th, 1942, 10:26 in the morning. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dauntless dive bomber screams toward the Japanese carrier Kaga in a 70-degree dive, the world reduced to a tunnel vision view of the flight deck rushing up at 300 miles per hour. His altimeter unwinds like a broken clock. 14,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. Through the windscreen, he can see Japanese sailors running across the deck, anti-aircraft guns firing, black puffs of flak bursting around him, but nothing stops the physics of a 3-ton aircraft in terminal velocity. At 2,000 feet, McCluskey releases his 1,000-pound bomb, pulls back hard on the stick, feeling G-forces crush him into the seat as the dauntless claws out of the dive. Behind him, his rear gunner screams that the bomb hit. McCluskey doesn't look back. He's flying on instinct now, jinking through anti-aircraft fire, trying to survive the next 60 seconds while behind him, Kaga's flight deck explodes in a fireball that can be seen from 40 miles away. The attack on the Japanese carriers happened with such compressed violence that participants would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe it coherently. McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise split into 2 groups, one attacking Kaga, the other hitting Akagi, the flagship of the carrier's striking force. The pilots had trained for months in dive bombing technique, but training against target rafts in calm Hawaiian waters bore no resemblance to diving through anti-aircraft fire at an evading carrier surrounded by screening vessels. Some pilots missed entirely, their bombs raising enormous geysers of white water 50 or 100 yards from their targets. But enough didn't miss. On Kaga, 4 bombs hit in quick succession. One penetrated the forward elevator, exploding in the hangar deck, where armed and fueled aircraft were being prepared for launch. The secondary explosion was catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited, torpedoes detonated, bomb magazines cooked off in chain reactions. Within 90 seconds, Kaga transformed from a functioning warship into a floating crematorium, her hangar deck a hell of fire and exploding ordnance that made damage control impossible. Akagi died slightly slower, but just as certainly. 2 bombs hit the flagship, one destroying the midship elevator, another striking aft near the ready aircraft. The damage alone might have been survivable, but the timing was catastrophic. Akagi's deck was crowded with aircraft armed for the strike against American carriers. Bombs hung under wings, fuel tanks topped off. When the American bombs hit, they didn't just damage the carrier. They ignited every aircraft on deck simultaneously. The resulting fire spread faster than damage control parties could move, fed by high-octane aviation fuel that burned at temperatures steel decks couldn't contain. Within minutes, the bridge became untenable from smoke and heat. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, had to transfer his flag to a cruiser, losing operational control at the battle's most critical moment. Akagi would burn for hours before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers, her crew abandoning ship while flames consumed everything above the waterline. At almost the same moment, 100 miles to the south, Yorktown's dive bombers found the 3rd Japanese carrier, Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntlesses against the carrier in a textbook attack that naval aviators would study for generations. His squadron approached from the sun, delayed recognition allowing them to begin their dives before Soryu's combat air patrol could intercept. 3 bombs hit in rapid sequence, 1 forward, 1 amidships, 1 aft. The damage pattern was catastrophically efficient, breaking Soryu's back structurally while igniting fires in 3 separate locations that prevented coordinated damage control. The carrier began listing almost immediately, her engineering spaces flooding, her hangar deck exploding as flames reached stored ordnance. She would sink in 20 minutes, the fastest death of any carrier at Midway, taking 711 men down with her, including her captain who chose to go down with his ship, according to Japanese naval tradition. In less than 6 minutes of actual combat, from 10:22 to 10:28, American dive bombers had mortally wounded 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The transformation from Japanese advantage to Japanese catastrophe happened so quickly that observers on both sides struggled to process the reversal. Japanese sailors who had launched against Midway that morning with absolute confidence in victory were now swimming in burning fuel oil, watching their carriers sink beneath them, trying to comprehend how the battle had turned so completely. American pilots pulling out of their dives and racing for home couldn't believe their own success. They had expected heavy losses, anticipated desperate fights against overwhelming defenses. Instead, they had encountered carriers almost undefended at altitude, their combat air patrol still at sea level slaughtering torpedo bombers, caught in the exact vulnerable moment Spruance had calculated. On Enterprise's flag bridge, Spruance listened to fragmentary radio reports from returning pilots with carefully controlled emotion. 3 carriers hit, 3 carriers burning, unconfirmed reports of explosions and secondary fires. He allowed himself one moment of satisfaction, a brief nod to his operations officer, before returning to tactical concerns. The battle wasn't over. Intelligence suggested 4 Japanese carriers. Only 3 were confirmed hit. The 4th was still operational, still capable of striking American carriers, still dangerous. Moreover, dozens of American aircraft were now returning to Enterprise and Hornet with battle damage, fuel exhaustion, wounded crew. The carriers needed to maintain course into the wind for recovery operations, making them vulnerable and predictable. Spruance calculated rapid-fire decisions about recovery timing, defensive positioning, preparing for potential Japanese counterattack. His mathematics had proven correct in predicting the optimal strike moment. Now he needed different mathematics to protect his carriers from retaliation. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from the other 3 carriers and escaped the initial American attack. At 130 hours, while American pilots were still landing back aboard their carriers, Hiryu launched a strike of 18 dive bombers against the American task force. The attack found Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, isolated and vulnerable during recovery operations. Japanese dive bombers scored 3 hits, penetrating Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires in her hangar, knocking out boilers and reducing her speed to 6 knots. The damage was severe but not immediately fatal. Yorktown's crew fought fires, restored partial power, even managed to recover a few aircraft. But at 14:30 hours, Hiryu launched a second strike, this time with torpedo bombers. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown's port side, the underwater explosions breaking her keel, flooding engine rooms, leaving her dead in the water and listing 17 degrees. Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser and ordered Yorktown abandoned. The carrier that had fought at Coral Sea and steamed to Midway despite crippling damage from earlier battles was finally dying. Spruance watched Yorktown's agony from Enterprise and made a cold calculation. Fletcher's transfer to a cruiser meant tactical command now devolved to Spruance. He was now responsible for all American carrier forces at Midway. His first decision reflected his analytical nature. He ordered reconnaissance aircraft to locate Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. At 1500 hours, scouts found her approximately 110 miles northwest of the American task force. Spruance immediately ordered a strike. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, the only aircraft he had ready for immediate launch. It was a smaller strike than the morning attack, but Hiryu was alone, separated from support, and American pilots now knew exactly where to find her. At 1700 hours, Enterprise's dive bombers struck Hiryu with 4 bombs, setting massive fires, leaving her dead in the water and burning out of control. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier striking force, the most powerful naval aviation force in the world, had been effectively destroyed in one day of combat. As the sun set on June 4th, Spruance faced his second crucial decision of the battle, one that would prove even more controversial than his morning launch. His staff officers, particularly Captain Browning, urged aggressive night pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet. The enemy was wounded, disorganized, fleeing westward. Browning argued for a high-speed chase, closing the distance overnight, potentially bringing the Japanese surface fleet to battle and finishing the destruction begun by the airstrikes. It was exactly the kind of aggressive action that Halsey would have ordered, the fighting spirit that American newspapers celebrated. Spruance listened to all arguments, then quietly refused. He would not pursue the Japanese fleet into night action. He would maintain position east of Midway, protecting the atoll while allowing the Japanese to escape westward. The staff was stunned. Browning argued vehemently. Spruance remained unmoved. His mathematics said the risk exceeded the potential gain, and his mathematics had been correct about everything else that day. The quiet man's restraint was about to become as historically significant as his morning aggression. June 4th, 1942, 1800 hours. The USS Enterprise steams eastward at 25 knots, opening range from the last known position of Japanese forces. On the flag bridge, Captain Miles Browning confronts Raymond Spruance with barely controlled fury, his voice rising loud enough that junior officers on the bridge pretend not to hear. "Admiral, we have the enemy running. We should pursue, close the distance, finish them. We have a chance to destroy their entire fleet." Spruance stands at the chart table, hands flat on the plotting surface, his face showing the fatigue of 16 hours of continuous combat operations. He responds with unusual sharpness. "Captain Browning, we have sunk 4 enemy carriers. We will not risk our own carriers chasing their battleships in the dark. This discussion is over." The finality in his voice leaves no room for appeal. Browning retreats, furious, convinced his admiral is throwing away the opportunity of the war. The afternoon and evening of June 4th revealed Spruance's most important quality as a naval commander: the discipline to protect victory, even when aggressive action seemed to promise greater gains. His staff couldn't fully understand his thinking because they didn't see the battle the way he saw it. They saw wounded Japanese forces retreating westward, carriers burning, the enemy demoralized and vulnerable. Spruance saw a still powerful Japanese surface fleet, including 11 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, dozens of destroyers, with vastly superior firepower in any night action. He saw American carriers with depleted air groups, exhausted pilots, no radar-directed night fighting capability, navigation challenges in coordinating complex movements in darkness. He calculated that chasing the Japanese fleet meant steaming into range of enemy battleships, risking a surface engagement where Japanese superiority in guns and armor would prove decisive. The mathematics were brutally clear: high probability of losing one or both American carriers, for uncertain probability of sinking additional Japanese vessels. Spruance's decision was made easier by studying history, particularly Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905. Togo had destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in the most decisive naval battle of the pre-aviation era, then carefully refrained from pursuing scattered Russian remnants into night action. Togo understood that protecting victory mattered more than maximizing destruction, that the strategic objective was achieved once Russian naval power was broken, regardless of how many individual ships escaped. Spruance saw exact parallels at Midway. 4 Japanese carriers sunk meant Japan's offensive capability was crippled, their strategic initiative broken. Sinking additional cruisers or battleships would make newspaper headlines but wouldn't fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Losing American carriers chasing those headlines would be catastrophic. The choice was obvious to Spruance, even if it frustrated his staff. But Spruance didn't simply retreat eastward. He maintained pursuit at cautious distance, trailing the Japanese fleet through the night of June 4th-5th, keeping them under surveillance with long-range patrol aircraft, positioning American forces to strike again if opportunity arose without excessive risk. It was pursuit defined by calculation rather than emotion, maintaining pressure while refusing decisive engagement. At midnight, he received a tempting target: a report of damaged Japanese cruisers lagging behind the main fleet, moving slowly westward, potentially vulnerable to airstrikes at dawn. Some staff officers urged immediate pursuit to close the distance for morning attack. Spruance calculated fuel states, aircraft readiness, the time required to arm and launch strikes. The damaged cruisers would be within range at dawn without high-speed overnight pursuit. He maintained his eastward course, conserving fuel, allowing air crews to rest. June 5th began with reconnaissance flights confirming the damaged cruisers' positions. At 0800 hours, Spruance launched a strike of 58 dive bombers and fighters to attack the cruisers Mogami and Makuma, both badly damaged from a midnight collision, while evading an American submarine. The strike found the cruisers exactly where reconnaissance reported, defended only by a few destroyers and long-range fighters. American dive bombers sank Makuma outright, left Mogami burning and crippled. It was additional destruction achieved through patient stalking rather than aggressive pursuit, vindicating Spruance's cautious approach. His staff began to understand his operational philosophy. You maximize destruction within calculated risk parameters, never exceeding those parameters regardless of temptation. By midday, June 5th, Spruance made his final major decision of the battle. He ordered Task Force 16 to retire eastward toward Pearl Harbor. The Japanese combined fleet was still retreating westward, still presented potential targets, still offered the theoretical possibility of further engagement. But Spruance calculated that the strategic objective was achieved. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed, 1 cruiser sunk, several cruisers damaged, approximately 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed along with their highly trained pilots. American losses: Yorktown sinking, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, 307 men killed. The exchange ratio was overwhelmingly in America's favor. Remaining in the Midway area meant operating at extended range from Pearl Harbor, exposing his carriers to submarine threat, risking his exhausted air crews in further operations. The mathematics said withdraw. Spruance withdrew. The decision generated immediate controversy that would follow Spruance for years. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, initially criticized the failure to pursue more aggressively, believing greater destruction of Japanese forces was possible. Naval aviators argued that Spruance's caution showed his black shoe mentality, that a true carrier admiral would have pressed the attack. Newspapers, hungry for complete victory narratives, questioned why the Japanese fleet escaped at all. The criticism bothered Spruance less than it might have bothered other commanders. He didn't care about newspaper coverage or popular opinion. He cared about strategic outcomes. Japan had lost 4 carriers that would take years to replace. Their pilot training pipeline was disrupted catastrophically. Their strategic offensive was broken. America retained its carrier striking power intact, except for Yorktown, which was damaged before Midway began. By every strategic metric that mattered, Midway was a decisive American victory. That some Japanese battleships escaped to fight another day was tactically frustrating but strategically irrelevant. Admiral Nimitz understood Spruance's thinking perfectly because Nimitz thought the same way. When Enterprise and Hornet returned to Pearl Harbor on June 13th, Nimitz met Spruance personally at Ford Island, shook his hand and said simply, "You did exactly what I hoped you would do." Coming from Nimitz, it was the highest possible praise. Nimitz had given Spruance discretion to exercise calculated risk. Spruance had struck aggressively when mathematics favored striking, withdrawn prudently when mathematics favored withdrawal. He had won the Pacific War's most decisive battle while losing only 1 carrier, an exchange ratio that no amount of aggressive pursuit could have improved significantly. Nimitz recognized in Spruance's performance something the Navy desperately needed: the intellectual maturity to see beyond tactical opportunities to strategic necessities. The broader Navy took longer to appreciate Spruance's achievement. Halsey remained the media favorite, the aggressive fighter whose fighting spirit matched American cultural expectations about military heroism. Spruance became a footnote in early Midway narratives, the stand-in who commanded because Halsey was sick, lucky enough to win but too cautious to maximize the victory. The characterization was profoundly wrong, but it persisted because it fit comfortable narratives about warrior virtues. What the public didn't see was what Nimitz saw clearly. Spruance had demonstrated a new kind of naval leadership, one suited to carrier warfare's unique demands. Carriers weren't battleships where aggressive tactics proved courage. Carriers were projection platforms, requiring protection, mathematical timing, understanding of geometric relationships between strike radius and defensive vulnerability. Spruance had mastered carrier warfare in 48 hours through pure intellectual application. His afternoon discipline mattered as much as his morning aggression, two parts of a complete understanding that would reshape American naval operations for the rest of the war. As Enterprise tied up at Pearl Harbor and exhausted sailors headed for shore leave, Spruance remained aboard preparing his after-action report. He wrote with characteristic precision, detailing decisions made, timing of events, lessons learned. He didn't praise himself, he didn't criticize subordinates who had questioned his decisions. He simply documented what happened with mathematical clarity. The report would become a foundational text at the Naval War College, studied by generations of officers learning carrier warfare. But Spruance wasn't thinking about his legacy when he wrote it. He was thinking about the next battle, the next operational problem, how to apply Midway's lessons to future challenges. The quiet man who won through calculation rather than courage was already planning how to do it again, better, with deeper understanding of the mathematics that governed modern naval warfare. His education was complete. His career was just beginning. June 7th, 1942, 0900 hours. Pearl Harbor Submarine Base, temporary headquarters of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz spreads reconnaissance photographs across his conference table, images of burning Japanese carriers taken by Midway-based patrol aircraft, visual confirmation of what radio reports had already indicated. Around the table sit his key staff officers, including Admiral Raymond Spruance, who arrived from Enterprise 2 hours earlier, still wearing the uniform he wore during 4 days of continuous operations. Nimitz studies the photographs with visible satisfaction, then looks up at Spruance. "Admiral, you've changed the strategic situation in the Pacific more decisively than any battle since Trafalgar. The question now is how we exploit what you've achieved." The statement carries weight beyond simple praise. Nimitz is already thinking 3 moves ahead, recognizing that Midway wasn't an end, but a beginning. The strategic implications of Midway became clear only gradually as intelligence assessments accumulated. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu. These weren't just ships. They were the Imperial Navy's primary striking power, the vessels that had dominated Pacific operations since Pearl Harbor. More crucially, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft and over 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of their most experienced carrier pilots. The Japanese naval aviation training pipeline couldn't replace that expertise quickly. A carrier pilot required 2 years of intensive training, thousands of hours of flight time, carrier landing qualification that was dangerous even in peacetime. Japan's training infrastructure couldn't produce replacement pilots at anything approaching the rate America's vast training establishment could generate. The human losses at Midway would compound over time, creating a qualitative gap in naval aviation that would prove decisive in future battles. From Tokyo's perspective, Midway represented catastrophic failure not just tactically, but conceptually. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation to force a decisive fleet engagement that would destroy American carrier power and compel negotiations. Instead, he had lost his own carrier striking force while American carriers remained operational. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted fundamentally. Before Midway, Japan held offensive initiative, could strike where and when they chose, forcing America to react defensively. After Midway, that initiative was broken. Japan would spend the rest of the war reacting to American moves, defending an overextended empire with diminishing resources against growing American power. Yamamoto recognized the shift immediately. He canceled all planned offensive operations, ordered remaining forces back to home waters, began preparing defensive strategies. The rising sun had reached its maximum extent and was beginning its long retreat. In Washington, the victory's strategic significance became clear to American leadership within days. President Franklin Roosevelt, facing grim news from Europe where Germany seemed unstoppable, suddenly had a genuine victory to announce. The Battle of Midway became the centerpiece of American propaganda, proof that Japan could be defeated, that the Pacific War was winnable. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, recognized that Midway created an opportunity for offensive operations that had seemed impossible weeks earlier. The Navy could now consider taking the strategic initiative, conducting operations designed to push Japan back rather than simply defending American positions. King began planning what would become the Guadalcanal Campaign, the first American offensive operation in the Pacific, possible only because Midway had broken Japanese carrier dominance. For Spruance personally, Midway transformed his career in ways he neither sought nor particularly wanted. Nimitz immediately promoted him to Chief of Staff, Pacific Fleet, making him responsible for operational planning across the entire theater. The appointment reflected Nimitz's recognition that Spruance's analytical skills were too valuable to limit to tactical command. In his new role, Spruance would help design the Central Pacific Offensive that would eventually win the war, applying his mathematical approach to strategic problems involving hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, amphibious operations on unprecedented scales. He approached the staff role with his characteristic methodical intensity, reading every intelligence report, studying Japanese defensive deployments, calculating logistics requirements for offensive operations that wouldn't begin for over a year. The broader Navy's reaction to Midway revealed institutional tensions about leadership styles and what victories actually proved. Aggressive admirals like Halsey received most public credit despite not participating. Media narratives emphasized American fighting spirit and courage, downplaying the intellectual preparation and calculated risk that actually won the battle. Spruance remained virtually unknown to the American public, his name appearing in newspaper accounts only as the officer who stood in for Halsey. He didn't care. He actively avoided publicity, refused interview requests, instructed his public affairs officer to decline all media inquiries. His reasoning was characteristically analytical. Publicity created pressure to make decisions that looked good publicly, rather than decisions that were operationally optimal. He wanted complete freedom to act on mathematical calculation, without wondering how decisions would appear in newspapers. It was an unusual stance for a flag officer in an era where media-savvy generals like MacArthur dominated headlines, but it reflected Spruance's fundamental belief that warfare was about achieving objectives, not building reputations. The Japanese reaction to Midway demonstrated how completely the battle had altered their strategic calculus. Emperor Hirohito and the Imperial General Staff conducted urgent assessments of Japan's position after the carrier losses. They concluded that offensive operations against American positions were no longer viable without carrier superiority. Japan's strategy shifted to defensive consolidation, holding a defensive perimeter from the Aleutians through the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia, hoping to make American advances so costly that negotiations would become preferable to continued fighting. It was a fundamental strategic miscalculation, underestimating American industrial capacity and overestimating American casualty sensitivity, but it revealed how decisively Midway had changed Japanese thinking. They were now fighting to preserve what they held, rather than expand their empire, a defensive mentality that would characterize Japanese operations for the rest of the war. Within the U.S. Navy, Midway generated intense analytical study as officers tried to understand what had actually produced the victory. Some credited American courage and fighting spirit, others emphasized superior intelligence from code breaking. Spruance, when asked in private staff meetings, offered a different analysis. The victory resulted from accepting calculated risk based on mathematical probability, launching strikes at maximum range, when conventional doctrine said wait for better intelligence, maintaining tactical discipline even when aggressive pursuit seemed tempting. He argued that future carrier battles would be won by commanders who understood the geometric relationships between carrier striking radius and defensive positioning, who could calculate optimal timing for strikes based on enemy operational cycles. Who could resist emotional impulses favoring dramatic action over strategically sound restraint? His analysis was too cerebral for some officers who preferred simple narratives about courage and determination. But Nimitz listened carefully, recognizing that Spruance had articulated a doctrine for carrier warfare that would guide American operations for the rest of the war. By July 1940, 2. 1 month after the battle, strategic consequences were cascading. America committed Marine forces to Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, beginning an offensive operation that would have been inconceivable before Midway. Japan was forced to divert resources to defend positions they had assumed were secure, stretching their forces across a perimeter too vast to defend effectively. The naval balance was shifting monthly as new American carriers completed construction while Japanese shipyards struggled to replace losses. Midway hadn't won the Pacific War, but it had created the conditions that made American victory inevitable, given sufficient time and resources. Spruance understood this better than most. He spent his days as Chief of Staff planning operations scheduled for 1943 and 1944, calculating logistics requirements, studying Japanese defensive capabilities, designing the island-hopping strategy that would carry American forces across the Pacific. The quiet man who won through mathematics was now applying those same analytical skills to strategic planning, proving that his talents extended beyond tactical command to operational art at the theater level. The turning of the tide at Midway was beginning to generate waves that would eventually crash against the Japanese home islands themselves. August 3, 1943, CINCPAC headquarters, Makalapa Hill overlooking Pearl Harbor. Raymond Spruance sits in a windowless planning room surrounded by maps covering entire walls, the Central Pacific spread across dozens of square feet of charts marked with Japanese positions, American bases, arrows indicating proposed offensive axes. For 14 months, he has served as Admiral Nimitz's Chief of Staff, transforming intelligence reports and strategic directives into operational plans. Today, he's briefing Nimitz on the final version of Operation Galvanic, the proposed assault on the Gilbert Islands scheduled for November. His presentation is characteristically precise. Ship allocations, logistics tonnages, timeline schedules down to hourly increments. Nimitz listens carefully, occasionally asking questions that probe assumptions or test alternative approaches. At the briefing's conclusion, Nimitz delivers news that will change Spruance's role fundamentally. You've planned this operation. Now you're going to execute it. I'm giving you command of Fifth Fleet. The transition from staff officer to fleet commander represented a dramatic shift in responsibility. As Chief of Staff, Spruance had been responsible for planning. As fleet commander, he would be responsible for results measured in ships sunk, islands captured, casualties suffered. Fifth Fleet in August 1943 represented the largest naval force under single command in American history. 6 heavy carriers, 5 light carriers, 7 fast battleships, approximately 20 cruisers, over 60 destroyers, hundreds of supporting vessels, total strength exceeding 700 ships and 200,000 men when amphibious forces were included. It dwarfed the task force Spruance commanded at Midway, required coordinating multiple carrier groups, surface action groups, amphibious forces, all operating across thousands of square miles of ocean. The complexity would have overwhelmed most admirals. Spruance approached it as a scaling problem, applying the same mathematical principles he used at Midway to challenges involving exponentially larger forces. His first task was developing doctrine for amphibious operations that didn't yet exist in effective form. The Marine Corps had developed theoretical amphibious warfare concepts during the interwar period, but those concepts had never been tested at the scale now required. Spruance needed to coordinate naval gunfire support, airstrikes, landing craft waves, logistics delivery to beaches, all while protecting the invasion force from Japanese counterattacks. He approached the problem systematically, breaking it into component parts: pre-invasion bombardment, mine clearing, underwater demolition, landing schedules, supply logistics, air defense. For each component, he calculated requirements, tested alternatives, wargamed scenarios. His planning staff grew to nearly 200 officers, all working on different aspects of future operations. Spruance coordinated their efforts with the same attention to detail he applied to his own calculations, reviewing every plan, questioning every assumption, demanding mathematical precision in all projections. The strategic concept guiding his planning was elegantly simple: drive directly across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines and Japan, seizing islands needed for air bases and logistic support, bypassing strong Japanese positions that could be isolated and neutralized without direct assault. It was the opposite of General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific strategy, which emphasized methodical advances through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Spruance's Central Pacific approach offered several advantages: shorter supply lines from Pearl Harbor, opportunities to use the Navy's carrier superiority where Japanese land-based air couldn't concentrate, forcing Japan to defend multiple threatened axes simultaneously. But it required unprecedented amphibious capabilities and accepting higher casualties in frontal assaults against fortified islands. The Joint Chiefs debated both approaches through summer 1943, eventually deciding to pursue both simultaneously, forcing Japan to divide defensive resources. Spruance's planning for the Gilbert Islands operation revealed his meticulous nature and also his capacity for innovation. The Gilberts included two primary targets, Macon and Tarawa. Macon was lightly defended, expected to fall easily. Tarawa was heavily fortified, with approximately 5,000 Japanese troops entrenched in bunkers and pillboxes defending Betio Island, the main objective. Spruance calculated that Tarawa would require overwhelming naval gunfire and air bombardment, followed by assault waves using amphibious tractors that could cross the reef protecting the lagoon. The tractors, designated LVT Amtraks, were new vehicles not fully tested in combat conditions. Some staff officers wanted to rely on conventional landing craft. Spruance insisted on the Amtraks, calculating that conventional craft would ground on the reef, leaving Marines exposed to fire while wading hundreds of yards to shore. His insistence on the new technology would prove partially correct and partially disastrous in ways he didn't anticipate. August 19, 1943, Spruance raised his 4-star Admiral flag aboard the new battleship USS Indiana, formally assuming command of 5th Fleet. The ceremony was brief, without the elaborate ritual some admirals favored. Spruance made no speeches, issued no stirring orders, simply took command and immediately began operational preparations for the November assault. His staff quickly learned his working style: 14-hour days, meticulous attention to logistics details, intolerance for optimistic assumptions unsupported by calculations, absolute insistence on planning for worst-case scenarios. He was not an easy commander to serve under. He asked difficult questions, rejected sloppy analysis, demanded that every plan have alternatives, and every alternative have resource requirements calculated to decimal precision. But his staff also recognized they were working for an officer who would never commit them to operations without exhaustive preparation. The strategic significance of Spruance's appointment extended beyond his individual capabilities. Nimitz was creating a command structure where Spruance and Halsey would rotate command of the same fleet, which would be designated 5th Fleet when Spruance commanded. 3rd Fleet when Halsey commanded. The rotation served multiple purposes. It rested commanders between major operations, it confused Japanese intelligence about American force strength, and it allowed Nimitz to employ both aggressive and analytical leadership styles depending on operational requirements. When bold offensive action was needed, Halsey commanded. When careful planning and execution mattered more, Spruance commanded. It was an elegant solution that recognized both officers' strengths while mitigating their weaknesses. The identical ships would operate with completely different tactical approaches depending on who was in command, a unique arrangement in naval history. During his final months as Chief of Staff before assuming fleet command, Spruance developed the overall strategic plan that would guide American operations through 1945. The sequence was clear: Gilberts in November 1943, Marshalls in January-February 1944, Marianas in June 1944, potential invasion of Japan in 1945. Each operation built on previous operations, advancing air bases closer to Japan, shortening supply lines, putting increasing pressure on Japanese defensive resources. Spruance calculated logistics requirements for each phase, projecting ship allocations, ammunition expenditure, casualty estimates based on expected Japanese resistance. His planning documents ran to thousands of pages, comprehensive analyses that some staff officers found overwhelming in their detail. Spruance found them merely adequate, always wanting more data, better calculations, refined projections. The intellectual challenge of planning operations on this scale energized Spruance in ways tactical command alone never could. He was designing not just battles but entire campaigns, thinking not in terms of single engagements, but sequential operations that would accumulate strategic advantage over years. It required different analytical skills than calculating optimal strike timing at Midway. He needed to understand industrial production schedules, shipbuilding timelines, training pipelines for new units, the complex logistics of supplying forces thousands of miles from home bases. He approached these challenges with the same mathematical rigor he applied to tactical problems, treating logistics as equations where inputs of raw materials and production capacity generated outputs of available forces and sustainable operations tempo. Some officers found his approach too mechanical, lacking proper appreciation for human factors and unpredictable contingencies. Spruance would argue that human factors and contingencies were precisely why mathematical planning mattered, to create sufficient reserves and alternatives that unpredictable events wouldn't derail operations. By autumn 1943, with Fifth Fleet conducting final training exercises before the Gilbert Islands assault, Spruance had transformed himself from tactical commander to strategic architect. The quiet man who won Midway through superior calculation was now designing the entire American advance across the Pacific through superior planning. He understood that modern warfare at this scale required intellectual preparation at least as much as combat leadership, that victories were built in planning rooms months before the first shot was fired in anger. His mathematical mind, once considered a limitation by officers who valued fighting spirit over analytical thinking, had proven ideally suited to warfare's industrial age demands. The education that began at the Naval War College decades earlier, continued through the crucible of Midway, was now reaching full expression in operational planning that would reshape the Pacific theater. The architect of advance was ready to test whether meticulous preparation could overcome the chaos of amphibious assault against fortified positions. The answer would come in November on the blood-soaked beaches of Tarawa, where Spruance's planning would face its first brutal test. November 20th, 1943, 0830 in the morning. Bravado Island, Tarawa Atoll. The first wave of Marines approaches the beach in LVT Amtraks, the amphibious tractors Spruance insisted on using. Behind them, conventional landing craft carrying follow-on waves ground to a halt 500 yards from shore, hung up on the reef that surrounds the lagoon. Marines jump into waist-deep water and begin wading toward shore under withering fire from Japanese machine guns and artillery. Aboard the battleship USS Maryland, 12,000 yards offshore, Raymond Spruance watches through binoculars as his meticulously planned assault disintegrates into chaos. The tide is lower than predicted. The naval gunfire bombardment proved less effective than calculated. Japanese defenses are far stronger than intelligence estimated. Marines are dying by dozens every minute, and the battle is barely 30 minutes old. Spruance's face shows no emotion, but his hands grip the binoculars tightly enough that his knuckles are white. Tarawa became the Pacific War's first truly horrific amphibious assault, a 3-day battle that would haunt Spruance for the rest of his life. The Japanese had fortified Bravado Island with unprecedented thoroughness. 500 pillboxes and bunkers built from reinforced concrete and coral, interconnected by trenches, defended by 4,800 elite troops who had orders to kill 10 Americans each before dying. The defensive positions were designed to survive naval bombardment, with bunkers buried under layers of coral and coconut logs that could withstand direct hits from 14-inch shells. American intelligence had identified the defenses but underestimated their strength by a factor of 3 or more. The pre-invasion bombardment, scheduled for 2.5 hours, would prove grossly insufficient to suppress defenders who were protected in bomb-proof shelters. The critical failure came from tidal miscalculation. Spruance's planning staff had consulted tide tables and local knowledge, predicting the lagoon would have 5 feet of water over the reef at H hour. Instead, the water was barely 3 feet deep, probably due to neap tide conditions that the tables hadn't accurately predicted. The LVT Amtraks could cross the shallow water, but there were only 75 Amtraks available for the first 3 waves. Follow-on waves in conventional Higgins boats grounded on the reef, forcing Marines to wade 500 to 700 yards under direct fire. Japanese gunners had pre-sighted every approach, turned the lagoon into a killing field. Marines loaded with 60 to 80 pounds of equipment struggled through chest-deep water while machine gun fire churned the surface around them. Those who reached the beach found a 4-foot seawall providing the only cover, Japanese bunkers just yards beyond delivering point-blank fire against anyone who tried to advance inland. The casualties were catastrophic. By noon on November 20th, over 500 Marines were dead or wounded. The assault appeared to be failing, and regimental commanders were requesting permission to withdraw. Spruance faced the most difficult decision of his career: continue the assault and accept horrific casualties, or withdraw and admit the entire operation was a failure based on inadequate planning. He chose to continue, reinforcing with reserve battalions, ordering naval gunfire to shift to targets inland of the beach, giving frontline Marines room to advance. His decision was cold calculation rather than emotional commitment. Withdrawal would mean those already dead had died for nothing, would surrender initiative to the Japanese, would call into question the entire Central Pacific strategy. Accepting higher casualties to achieve the objective was mathematically optimal, even if morally agonizing. November 21st brought even heavier fighting as Marines pushed inland yard by yard, destroying bunkers individually with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The combat was intimate and brutal, often at ranges of feet rather than yards, Japanese defenders fighting to the death from positions that had to be reduced, one at a time. Spruance remained aboard Maryland, receiving hourly casualty reports that climbed steadily. 600 dead, 800, 1,000. Each report was another indictment of his planning, another calculation that proved wrong under actual combat conditions. His staff officers avoided his presence, uncertain what to say to an admiral whose meticulous preparation had led to this slaughter. Spruance said nothing, simply continued directing naval gunfire support and coordinating reinforcements, his face impassive even as the casualty numbers became horrific. By November 2030, 76 hours after the assault began, Baidio Island was secured. American forces counted 4,800 Japanese dead, only 17 prisoners, the defenders having fought essentially to the last man. American casualties: 1,207 Marines killed, 2,300 wounded out of an assault force of 18,000. The casualty rate exceeded 10%, far higher than any previous Pacific amphibious operation. When Spruance went ashore on November 24th to inspect the battlefield, he walked through scenes that would give him nightmares for years. Burned-out bunkers still containing charred corpses, demolished defensive positions showing how strong they had actually been, the narrow beach still stained with blood despite tidal washing. He spoke quietly with surviving Marine officers, asking detailed questions about what went wrong, what could have been done better, accepting responsibility without offering excuses. The public reaction to Tarawa was shock and anger. American newspapers published casualty figures and asked whether the island was worth such horrific losses. Baidio was barely 3 miles long, strategically important only as an airfield site, seemingly a trivial objective to justify over 3,000 casualties. Congressional representatives demanded explanations, questioned the entire Central Pacific strategy, suggested that MacArthur's Southwest Pacific approach with lower casualty rates should receive priority. The criticism wounded Spruance more deeply than he showed publicly. He had promised Nimitz that meticulous planning would minimize casualties, that mathematical preparation would give American forces overwhelming advantages. Instead, his planning had failed to account for tide conditions, had underestimated defensive strength, had resulted in the most costly amphibious assault in American military history to that point. But Spruance's response to Tarawa revealed his greatest quality as a commander: the capacity to learn from failure without being paralyzed by it. Within days of securing Baidio, he convened planning conferences to analyze everything that went wrong and identify solutions. Tidal miscalculation. Future operations would include submarine reconnaissance of reef depths and multiple tide predictions from different sources. Inadequate naval gunfire. Bombardment schedules would be extended to 7 or 10 days for heavily fortified targets, with battleships firing until ammunition magazines were nearly exhausted. Japanese bunkers surviving bombardment. New operational concept. Underwater demolition teams would proceed assaults, clearing obstacles, and assessing defenses before Marines landed. Insufficient amphibious tractors. Procurement orders went out for hundreds more LVTs, enough to transport entire assault waves across reefs. Spruance also recognized a fundamental conceptual error in his Tarawa planning. He had treated the assault as primarily a naval fire support problem, when it was actually a combined arms problem requiring perfect coordination between naval gunfire, airstrikes, and ground assault. For future operations, he developed new command arrangements, putting naval and marine commanders in direct communication, established fire support coordination centers that could shift naval gunfire within minutes based on ground force requests, created air liaison teams that embedded with marine units to call in strikes against specific targets. These innovations would become standard doctrine for Pacific amphibious operations, but they were purchased with marine blood at Tarawa. Within the Navy, opinions divided sharply about whether Tarawa vindicated or condemned the Central Pacific strategy. Some admirals argued that the casualties proved frontal assaults against fortified islands were unsustainable, that MacArthur's strategy of bypassing strong points was superior. Others noted that despite horrific casualties, Tarawa was secured in 3 days, the airfield was operational within a week, and American forces now had a base for operations against the Marshall Islands. Spruance himself took the middle position. Tarawa was necessary strategically, but could have been executed better tactically with superior planning and resources. His after-action report was brutally honest about failures, generous in praising Marine valor, and comprehensive in proposing solutions. Nimitz read the report and recognized that Spruance had passed a different kind of test than Midway represented, the test of maintaining strategic focus despite tactical setbacks, the discipline to learn from failure without losing confidence in the overall approach. The ultimate strategic judgment on Tarawa would come 6 weeks later in the Marshall Islands, where Spruance would apply every lesson learned and prove that American amphibious doctrine could achieve objectives with minimal casualties when properly executed. But in late November 1943, standing on blood-soaked Bedio beaches surrounded by evidence of massive casualties resulting from his inadequate planning, Spruance experienced the darkest moment of his naval career. The quiet man who thought in mathematics had discovered that some variables, tidal anomalies, defensive strength, the chaos of combat, resisted calculation. He would spend the rest of his career trying to account for those variables, striving for the impossible goal of planning that could anticipate every contingency. Tarawa taught him humility without breaking his confidence, showed him the limits of calculation without making him abandon mathematical thinking. It was a bitter education, paid for in Marine blood, but it would make him a better fleet commander for the far larger operations that lay ahead. January 31st, 1940, 4:07 hours. Kwajalein Atoll, Marshall Islands. The battleship USS Tennessee unleashes a broadside from her 12 14-inch guns, the concussion rattling windows on ships 5 miles away, the shells arcing toward Japanese positions on Kwajalein Island. She is one of 7 battleships pounding the island, joined by 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and dozens of destroyers, delivering what will eventually total 48,000 tons of naval gunfire in 7 days of preliminary bombardment. In his flag plot aboard the new battleship USS Indianapolis, Raymond Spruance watches the bombardment with grim satisfaction. This is not Tarawa. This time he has planned for overwhelming firepower, extended preparation, sufficient amphibious resources, every lesson from November's bloodbath incorporated into operational doctrine. The Marines going ashore today will face Japanese defenses that have been systematically destroyed over a week of continuous bombardment, rather than 3 hours. The mathematics of amphibious assault are about to receive a very different test. The Marshall's operation represented Spruance's redemption after Tarawa, a chance to prove that meticulous planning could minimize casualties when properly resourced and executed. He had spent December 1943 completely redesigning amphibious doctrine based on Tarawa's lessons. The changes were comprehensive and expensive. Preliminary bombardment extended from hours to days, with battleships allocated ammunition loads 5 times larger than Tarawa. Underwater demolition teams, the predecessors of Navy SEALs, were formed and trained to scout beaches before assaults, clearing obstacles and providing detailed intelligence about defensive positions. The number of LVT amphibious tractors increased from 75 at Tarawa to 96 for the Marshalls, enough to transport assault waves directly to beaches without forcing Marines to wait under fire. Aircraft carriers allocated more planes to close air support rather than fleet defense, providing continuous strikes against Japanese positions coordinated with naval gunfire. But Spruance's most audacious decision came in target selection. The original plan called for methodical advances through the Marshall Islands, capturing outer Talls first, then moving to Kwajalein in the center. Spruance calculated a different approach. Strike Kwajalein directly, bypassing outer islands like Wache, Maloelap, and Jaluit, where Japan had concentrated forces. The bypassed islands would be isolated by American air power operating from Tarawa, neutralized without costly assaults. It was strategic boldness from an admiral the Navy considered cautious, geometric thinking that recognized some positions could be more effectively defeated through isolation than direct assault. Admiral King, in Washington, initially resisted, nervous about leaving Japanese forces in the rear. Nimitz supported Spruance, recognizing the mathematical elegance of the approach. The decision was approved, and Spruance's Marshall's plan became the template for island hopping across the Pacific. The assault on Kwajalein began February 1st, with Marines landing on both ends of the atoll's main island. The contrast with Tarawa was immediately apparent. Marines encountered destroyed defenses, cratered bunkers, shattered artillery positions, the result of 7 days of bombardment that had exceeded Tarawa's 3-hour preparation by a factor of 50. LVT Amtraks carried assault waves directly to shore, no Marines waiting under fire through lagoon shallows. Naval gunfire shifted inland as Marines advanced, battleships firing on call to destroy specific targets identified by forward observers. Close air support arrived within minutes of requests, dive bombers hitting bunkers and strong points with precision. The coordination Spruance had designed in planning rooms worked in actual combat, the components of amphibious warfare finally functioning as an integrated system. The casualties told the story of improved doctrine. Kwajalein was secured in 3 days with 372 American dead, compared to over 1,000 at Tarawa. The exchange ratio was even more favorable. 4,800 Japanese defenders killed, virtually none surrendering for casualties that were 1/3 of Tarawa, despite comparable enemy force strength. Spruance's staff calculated the improvement resulted from the extended bombardment, better coordination, and sufficient amphibious resources, all factors that could be quantified and replicated in future operations. The lesson was expensive in time and ammunition, but cheap in lives. Overwhelming firepower properly applied made frontal assaults survivable, where inadequate preparation produced slaughter. February 17th and 18 brought the Eniwetok operation, the final objective in the Marshall's campaign. Spruance applied the same doctrine. 7-day preliminary bombardment, underwater demolition teams, scouting defenses, coordinated naval gunfire and air support, sufficient LVTs for assault waves. Eniwetok fell in 48 hours with minimal casualties. 3 atolls secured in a single operation that worked with machine-like efficiency. The Japanese defenders fought with the same fanatical determination they showed at Tarawa, but American operational superiority proved overwhelming. By February 2002, the entire Marshall Islands chain was secured. 13,000 Japanese troops killed or isolated on bypassed islands. American casualties totaling fewer than 500 dead across all operations. The strategic implications exceeded the tactical victories. The Marshalls provided air bases 1,000 miles closer to Japan than the Gilberts, shortening the distance American forces needed to advance to reach the Philippines. The bypassed islands, containing 13,000 Japanese troops, were neutralized without combat, left to wither on the vine, as Spruance's planning documents described. Japanese defensive strategy, which assumed Americans would advance methodically island by island, was rendered obsolete by operations that struck deep into their defensive perimeter. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was significant. If Americans could bypass strong points, then every island garrison faced potential isolation without hope of relief or reinforcement. Japanese defensive planning became increasingly difficult as they tried to determine which positions would be attacked and which bypassed. For Spruance personally, the Marshall's operation represented complete vindication after Tarawa's trauma. He had absorbed the lessons, redesigned the doctrine, executed nearly flawlessly. The casualty reduction from over 10% at Tarawa to less than 2% in the Marshalls proved that mathematical planning could work when properly resourced and implemented. Emmett sent Spruance a personal message. The capture of the Marshalls stands as one of the most brilliant operations in military history. Minimum casualties for maximum strategic gain achieved through superior planning and execution. Coming from Nimitz, whose praise was always measured, the commendation meant everything to Spruance. The lessons from the Marshalls would guide American amphibious operations for the rest of the war. The doctrine of overwhelming preliminary bombardment, underwater demolition reconnaissance, coordinated fire support, and sufficient specialized equipment became standard procedure. Future operations at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would follow the Marshall's template, adjusted for scale and specific conditions, but built on the same fundamental principles. Some operations would prove far more costly than the Marshalls as Japanese defenses evolved and resistance stiffened, but none would suffer from the kind of planning inadequacies that characterized Tarawa. Spruance had transformed American amphibious capability from experimental to systematically effective through a process of analysis, learning, and rigorous application of mathematical principles to military problems. March 1944 found Spruance planning his next major operation, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, scheduled for June. The Marianas represented a far larger challenge than the Marshalls, defended by over 60,000 Japanese troops on 3 major islands within range of Japanese land-based air power, critically important to Japan's defensive perimeter. Capturing the Marianas would provide bases for B-29 bombers, capable of reaching the Japanese home islands, bringing America's strategic bombing campaign directly to Japan's industrial centers. The operation would be the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history to that point, requiring over 600 ships and 127,000 troops. It would also require defeating the Japanese combined fleet if they came out to defend positions they couldn't afford to lose. Spruance would face both the operational challenge of amphibious assault and the tactical challenge of a major fleet engagement, testing his abilities as both planner and combat commander simultaneously. As Spruance's planning staff worked through logistics calculations for the Marianas operation, analyzing supply requirements, calculating bombardment ammunition needs, designing landing schedules, the Admiral spent his evenings studying historical precedents for large-scale amphibious operations. He read about Normandy planning, still months in the future but already under preparation in England. He studied World War I's Gallipoli campaign, a catastrophic failure that showed what happened when amphibious assaults were inadequately supported. He reviewed ancient campaigns where naval forces projected power ashore, looking for principles that transcended technology. His staff sometimes found him in the flag plot at midnight, poring over charts and logistics tables, calculating and recalculating variables, looking for the optimal solutions that would minimize casualties while achieving strategic objectives. The Marshall's masterpiece had proven that Spruance's analytical approach to warfare worked when properly applied. The quiet man who won Midway through calculation had now demonstrated he could design and execute amphibious operations with similar mathematical precision. His reputation within the Navy was evolving from the admiral who got lucky at Midway to the planner who perfected amphibious warfare. But the greatest test of his career was approaching. The Mariana Islands campaign would require not just planning but also fleet battle against the combined fleet in what would become the largest carrier engagement in history. The architect of advance was about to become the combat commander again, and the mathematics that worked for amphibious planning would face a very different examination in high-speed carrier warfare, where timing mattered in minutes and positioning mattered in miles. The education that began at Newport, proved at Midway, bloodied at Tarawa, vindicated in the Marshalls, was about to face its ultimate test in the waters west of Saipan. June 19, 1940, 4:10 hours. 210 miles west of Saipan, Mariana Islands. The sky above Task Force 58 erupts with anti-aircraft fire as Japanese aircraft appear on radar screens. Incoming raids detected at 150 miles range. On the flag bridge of USS Indianapolis, Raymond Spruance stands beside Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the aggressive carrier task force commander who wants desperately to steam west toward the Japanese fleet and strike first. Spruance refuses. His orders are clear: protect the Saipan invasion beaches, maintain position between the Japanese fleet and American amphibious forces, accept defensive battle rather than offensive pursuit. Mitcher is frustrated almost to the point of insubordination, convinced Spruance's caution will let the Japanese fleet escape. But Spruance's mathematics say differently. The Japanese are launching from maximum range. Their aircraft must fly over 200 miles to reach American carriers, and that distance represents opportunity for slaughter on a scale naval aviation has never seen. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, became the decisive carrier engagement of the Pacific War and the most controversial decision of Spruance's career. The strategic situation was clear. American forces had invaded Saipan on June 15th, putting troops ashore on an island Japan considered part of their inner defensive perimeter. The Japanese combined fleet sortied from the Philippines to destroy the American invasion, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, with 9 carriers and 430 aircraft. American intelligence detected the Japanese fleet on June 18th, approximately 400 miles west of Saipan. Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the largest concentration of American naval power ever assembled. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers, 956 aircraft. American numerical superiority was overwhelming, but geography favored Japan. The geometric problem was brutally simple. Japanese carriers could launch aircraft at 350 to 400 miles range, because their planes would land at Guam after attacking, refuel there, and attack again before returning to their carriers. American aircraft had to return to their carriers after attacking, limiting effective strike radius to approximately 250 miles. This meant Japanese carriers could strike American forces from ranges where American strikes couldn't effectively respond. Ozawa's plan was elegant. Launch maximum strikes from 350 miles, shuttle aircraft through Guam, achieve numerical superiority through the 2-cycle attack pattern. If the plan worked, Japanese land-based air from Guam combined with carrier strikes would overwhelm American defenses. If it failed, the Japanese fleet would still be too far west for American carriers to retaliate effectively. Spruance understood Ozawa's plan because he had studied Japanese carrier doctrine for years. He also understood the plan's critical vulnerability. It assumed American carriers would steam west aggressively to close the range, standard offensive doctrine that Halsey would certainly follow. Spruance calculated a different approach. Stay east, close to Saipan, force Japanese aircraft to fly maximum range to attack American carriers. At that range, Japanese planes would arrive with minimal fuel reserves, unable to maneuver extensively in combat, desperate to land anywhere after engaging. American fighters operating close to their carriers would have maximum combat time and fuel to engage incoming raids. It was defensive positioning chosen for mathematical advantage rather than offensive spirit, exactly the kind of calculated risk Nimitz had authorized at Midway. June 19th began with American submarines detecting the Japanese fleet and reporting their position. Mitcher immediately requested permission to launch strikes, arguing that American carriers needed to hit the Japanese first to achieve maximum advantage. Spruance refused. The Japanese were still 350 miles west, beyond effective American strike range. Steaming west at high speed would uncover the Saipan invasion beaches, exactly what Japanese strategy hoped to achieve. better to maintain position, let the Japanese come to him, destroy their aircraft as they arrived, then decide whether to pursue the weakened enemy fleet. Mitscher argued vehemently, his staff officers barely concealing their contempt for what they considered black-shoe caution. Spruance remained unmoved. His orders stood, maintain defensive position until the Japanese fleet came within effective range. At 1000 hours, radar detected the first Japanese raid, 69 aircraft approaching from the west. American fighters scrambled, vectored to intercepts by radar controllers, met the incoming raid 70 miles from the task force. What followed was slaughter. American Hellcat fighters superior to Japanese Zeros in speed and firepower, torn into formations of Japanese aircraft flown by replacement pilots with minimal training. The veteran aviators who fought at Midway and Coral Sea were dead, replaced by young pilots rushed through truncated training programs. They flew courageously but incompetently, unable to execute the coordinated tactics that had made Japanese naval aviation so dangerous in 1942. American fighters shot down 42 of 69 aircraft in the first raid, losing 2 Hellcats. The survivors who reached the task force faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from battleships and cruisers equipped with new proximity-fused shells that exploded near aircraft automatically. 5 more Japanese planes were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Only 22 aircraft survived to return to their carriers, and they achieved 0 hits on American ships. The second raid arrived at 1100 hours. 109 aircraft, the largest single formation launched by Japanese carriers at Philippine Sea. American radar detected them 150 miles out. Fighter directors vectored 50 Hellcats to intercept. The aerial combat was so one-sided, it became almost recreational for American pilots, shooting down 70 aircraft in minutes of fighting. Survivors who penetrated to the task force faced anti-aircraft fire that destroyed another 20 planes. 9 Japanese aircraft survived the raid. They damaged 1 battleship slightly, achieved no significant hits. American losses: 0 aircraft shot down in air combat, 3 destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from their own ships and identification errors. The exchange ratio was 30 Japanese aircraft lost for every American plane destroyed, a level of dominance that stunned even experienced American pilots. Throughout the day, 4 major Japanese raids attacked Task Force 58. By 1700 hours, the accounting was complete. 328 Japanese aircraft launched, 243 destroyed, only 85 surviving to return to their carriers or land at Guam. American losses: 29 aircraft, mostly operational accidents rather than combat losses. The turkey shoot nickname was harsh but accurate. American pilots compared the combat to shooting turkeys, barely trained Japanese pilots presenting easy targets. But the one-sided victory came at a cost that many naval officers considered unacceptable. While American fighters were destroying Japanese aircraft, American submarines were sinking Japanese carriers. The USS Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho, flagship of the Japanese fleet. USS Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. Both carriers would sink that evening. But Ozawa's remaining carriers were still 400 miles west, beyond range of American strikes, potentially escaping. As afternoon became evening, Mitscher renewed his requests to pursue the Japanese fleet westward. His staff prepared strike plans, calculated intercept courses, argued that a high-speed pursuit could bring Japanese carriers within strike range by dawn on June 20th. Spruance listened to all arguments, studied the tactical situation, and made the decision that would haunt his reputation for decades. He would not pursue aggressively during the night. Task Force 58 would maintain its position east of Saipan through darkness, protecting the invasion beaches, then pursue at moderate speed at dawn. His reasoning was characteristic. Night pursuit at high speed meant steaming toward a potentially superior surface force in darkness, risking exactly the battleship engagement where Japanese advantages in night fighting might prove decisive. Better to wait for daylight, locate the Japanese fleet through reconnaissance, strike with full strength when positions were confirmed. The decision generated immediate controversy. Mitcher's staff officers openly criticized Spruance's caution, arguing that he was letting the combined fleet escape, that aggressive pursuit could destroy the Japanese fleet completely rather than merely damage it. Some went further, suggesting that Spruance's black shoe mentality made him unsuited for carrier command, that a true aviation admiral would have pursued aggressively regardless of risk. The criticism reached Spruance, but didn't change his calculation. He had been ordered to protect the Saipan invasion. He had destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in one day, the most lopsided aerial victory in naval history. 2 Japanese carriers were sinking. The strategic objective was achieved. Pursuing into night action risked his carriers for uncertain additional gains. The mathematics favored his decision, even if the emotions of aggressive officers did not. June 20th brought vindication and frustration simultaneously. American scout planes located the Japanese fleet at 1,500 hours, but at 350 miles range, the absolute limit of American strike capability. Mitcher requested permission to launch despite the extreme range. Spruance approved, recognizing this might be the only opportunity to strike the fleeing enemy. 216 American aircraft launched in late afternoon, flew to maximum range, found and attacked the Japanese fleet at sunset. They sank 1 carrier, damaged 2 others, destroyed 65 additional Japanese aircraft. But the extreme range created a different catastrophe. American aircraft returning in darkness, many damaged, most critically low on fuel, couldn't find their carriers in the blackness. Mitcher made a bold decision: turn on all task force lights, illuminating carriers for returning aircraft, despite exposing ships to potential submarine attack. Even with lights, 80 American aircraft crashed into the ocean from fuel exhaustion, 49 aviators dying in the darkness. It was the highest single-day American aircraft loss in the Pacific War. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended on June 21st. With both fleets withdrawing, the Japanese in full retreat, American forces returning to support the Saipan invasion. The strategic accounting was overwhelmingly in America's favor. 3 Japanese carriers sunk, approximately 600 Japanese aircraft destroyed, Japan's carrier aviation capability effectively eliminated as an offensive threat. American losses: minimal ship damage, 130 aircraft, 76 aircrew, mostly from the June 20th long-range strike rather than combat losses. The exchange ratio was approximately 8-1 in America's favor, one of the most lopsided victories in naval warfare history. But the controversy about whether Spruance should have pursued more aggressively would persist for decades, dividing naval officers into those who valued his strategic restraint and those who believed he missed an opportunity to destroy the Japanese fleet completely. The quiet man who won through calculation had once again chosen protection over pursuit, strategic security over tactical glory, accepting a decisive victory while declining the gamble for total victory. Whether that choice was wisdom or timidity would be debated as long as naval historians studied the Pacific War. August 26, 1940-4, Pearl Harbor submarine base. Raymond Spruance walks down the pier where USS New Jersey is moored, his flagship for the past 6 months, now being turned over to Vice Admiral William Halsey for the Philippines campaign. On the fantail, Halsey waits in tropical khakis, his famous broad smile visible even from a distance, the aggressive warrior who represents everything the American public believes an admiral should be. The 2 men shake hands cordially, genuine respect despite fundamentally different approaches to naval warfare. They spend 2 hours in New Jersey's flag plot, Spruance briefing Halsey on Fifth Fleet's current status, ship dispositions, operational plans, pending maintenance schedules. Halsey listens, but his mind is already racing ahead to offensive operations, how he'll use these same ships aggressively in ways Spruance never would. When Spruance departs, Fifth Fleet becomes Third Fleet simply by changing admirals. The same ship suddenly commanded by a completely different philosophy. The Halsey-Spruance command rotation represented one of the most unusual arrangements in naval history, a system where the same fleet alternated between 2 admirals with opposite temperaments and tactics. The practical reason was rest. Commanding fleets of over 100 ships was exhausting, required months of continuous operations, produced mental fatigue that degraded decision-making. Rotating command every 4 to 6 months allowed each admiral to rest, plan future operations, recover before returning to sea. But the arrangement also had a deeper strategic purpose that Nimitz recognized even if he never articulated it explicitly. Different operations required different leadership styles. Some situations demanded Halsey's aggressive pursuit and fighting spirit. Others required Spruance's calculated restraint and mathematical precision. By alternating command, Nimitz could match leadership style to operational requirements. The two admirals could hardly have been more different personally and professionally. Halsey was 62 years old in summer 1944, a big personality who loved publicity, gave quotable interviews, inspired men through personal charisma and visible courage. He had earned his reputation through aggressive carrier raids early in the war, strikes against Japanese-held islands that boosted American morale when morale desperately needed boosting. His philosophy of naval warfare was intuitive and offensive. Find the enemy, close quickly, strike hard, pursue relentlessly. He believed in momentum, in keeping pressure on the enemy, in accepting risks to achieve decisive results. His famous quote summarized his approach: hit hard, hit fast, hit often. It was fighting philosophy that resonated with American cultural values about courage, determination, and aggressive action. Spruance was 58 years old, quiet and reserved, actively avoided publicity, inspired confidence through competence rather than charisma. His reputation rested on intellectual achievement rather than fighting spirit. Midway, the Philippine Sea, the systematic development of amphibious doctrine that made island hopping possible. His philosophy was analytical and defensive. Calculate optimal positioning, accept only risks where probability favored success. Protect what you've achieved. Recognize that preserving your force sometimes mattered more than destroying enemy forces. He believed in planning, in mathematical optimization, in strategic patience. No one ever quoted Spruance because he never said anything quotable. He communicated in operational orders and planning documents, precision and clarity valued over inspiration. Their tactical approaches revealed the philosophical divide most clearly. At the Philippine Sea, Spruance maintained defensive positioning, refused to pursue aggressively, protected the invasion beaches while accepting that some Japanese ships would escape. Staff officers who served under both admirals universally agreed that Halsey would have ordered aggressive pursuit, steamed west at high speed, closed range regardless of risk, struck the Japanese carriers repeatedly until they were all sunk or his own carriers were crippled. Whether that approach would have succeeded or resulted in disaster, no one could say with certainty, but it would have been dramatically different from Spruance's cautious positioning. October 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, where Halsey's command of Third Fleet demonstrated both the strengths and catastrophic dangers of his aggressive philosophy. When Japanese carriers appeared north of the Philippines, Halsey took the bait, steaming north with his entire fleet to pursue and destroy them. What he didn't know was that the Japanese carriers were decoys, nearly empty of aircraft, designed specifically to pull American carriers away from the invasion beaches. While Halsey chased decoys northward, Japanese battleships nearly broke through weakly defended San Bernardino Strait and attacked the invasion fleet. Only desperate resistance by escort carriers and destroyers prevented catastrophe. Halsey sank the decoy carriers, but came within hours of presiding over the worst American naval defeat since Pearl Harbor. Spruance's staff officers, watching Leyte Gulf develop from planning offices at Pearl Harbor, recognized immediately what Spruance would have done differently. He would have left a powerful surface force guarding San Bernardino Strait, divided his carriers to cover both threats, accepted smaller victories to prevent any chance of disaster. It was the same philosophy that guided his Philippine Sea decisions. Strategic security mattered more than tactical opportunity. The contrast demonstrated that neither approach was universally correct. Sometimes Halsey's aggression achieved results Spruance's caution couldn't match. Sometimes Spruance's restraint prevented disasters Halsey's aggression courted. Nimitz's genius was recognizing that both approaches had value and creating a command structure that could employ both. The officers who served under both admirals developed strong preferences, Aviation officers generally preferred Halsey, feeling he understood carrier warfare's offensive potential in ways Spruance never fully grasped. Surface warfare officers often preferred Spruance, appreciating his attention to tactical details and protective positioning that kept ships safer. Younger officers loved Halsey's inspirational leadership and quotable quotes. Senior planners respected Spruance's intellectual rigor and operational precision. The Navy contained room for both types, but the institutional culture tended to celebrate Halsey's approach while viewing Spruance's caution with some suspicion. Combat leadership was supposed to involve visible courage and aggressive action, not quiet calculation and mathematical restraint. The statistical comparison told an interesting story. Operations under Spruance's command showed average naval losses of approximately 4%, with high mission success rates and objectives achieved within predicted timelines. Operations under Halsey showed average naval losses of approximately 7%, with more variable results, some spectacular successes and some near disasters. The 3% difference in loss rates might seem small, but across hundreds of ships and thousands of men, it represented substantial casualties. Whether Spruance's lower losses resulted from superior judgment or excessive caution remained debatable. Whether Halsey's higher losses represented acceptable risks for greater gains or reckless endangerment depended on which operations you examined. By December 1944, as Halsey continued operations in the Philippines and Spruance planned the invasion of Iwo Jima scheduled for February 1945, the strategic situation was becoming clear. America was winning the Pacific War through industrial superiority, code-breaking advantages, and improving tactical competence. But the winning was grinding, expensive, producing casualties that shocked the American public. Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be far bloodier than anything yet experienced. Those operations would be Spruance's responsibility, testing whether his methodical planning could minimize casualties in operations where Japanese defenders had months to prepare and American forces had no choice but frontal assault. The philosophical divide between aggressive pursuit and calculated restraint would matter less in those battles than simply executing overwhelming force competently. But Spruance would bring his analytical approach to operations, where mathematics increasingly struggled to model the chaos of combat against an enemy embracing total defense and ritual death. February 19, 1940 to 5:08:59 in the morning. USS El Dorado amphibious command ship off Iwo Jima. Raymond Spruance stands in the flag plot watching banks of radio receivers and status boards as the first wave of Marines approaches the beaches of the tiny volcanic island, 8 square miles in area. Through binoculars, he can see Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano dominating the southern tip, its slopes honeycombed with Japanese defensive positions that 3 days of naval bombardment have barely touched. The beaches are black volcanic sand, distinctive and terrifying. At 0900 exactly, the first Amtraks grind ashore, Marines jumping out and beginning to advance. For 90 seconds nothing happens, no resistance, Marines moving inland unopposed. Then the entire island explodes with defensive fire. Hidden artillery, mortars, machine guns all opening fire simultaneously. Marines drop by dozens. Spruance's face goes rigid. He's watching the beginning of the bloodiest operation in Marine Corps history. Iwo Jima represented everything the Pacific War had become by early 1945, a grinding attritional struggle against an enemy who refused surrender, accepted total death, and prepared defenses with engineering sophistication that made frontal assault horrifically expensive. The island was militarily insignificant, a volcanic rock midway between the Marianas and Japan, valuable only as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japanese cities. But its strategic position made it essential, and Japanese commanders understood American need made defense practical. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, commanding the island's defense, had spent months creating the most sophisticated defensive system yet encountered in the Pacific. 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions, artillery hidden in caves impervious to naval bombardment, interlocking fields of fire covering every approach, 21,000 defenders ordered to kill 10 Americans each before dying. The assault began February 19th after 3 days of naval bombardment that consumed more shells than any previous Pacific operation, but barely damaged defenses buried deep underground. Spruance had allocated 7 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 12 destroyers for fire support, the most powerful naval force ever assigned to support a single amphibious landing. They fired continuously for 72 hours, delivering 40,000 tons of naval shells and bombs. Observers watching from ships thought the bombardment must have killed everything on the island, pulverized every defensive position, made landing unopposed. Instead, Japanese defenders waited in their tunnels for the bombardment to lift, then emerged and began killing Marines with systematic efficiency. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days, the longest and costliest single operation in Marine Corps history. Spruance remained off the island throughout, directing naval gunfire support, coordinating airstrikes, watching casualty reports climb with each passing day. By D+2, casualties exceeded 2,000. By D+5, 4,000. By D+10, 8,000. The numbers kept rising with mathematical inevitability, each yard of advance costing lives measured in dozens. Marines fought with extraordinary courage, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to reduce defensive positions one at a time, often at ranges measured in feet. But courage couldn't overcome geometry and concrete. Japanese positions were mutually supporting. Advancing against one bunker exposed Marines to fire from 3 others, required methodical reduction that consumed time and lives in brutal proportion. March 26th, USS Indianapolis, now Spruance's flagship, took a torpedo from a Japanese submarine while withdrawing from Iwo Jima operations. The explosion killed 9 sailors, flooded several compartments, forced Spruance to transfer his flag to battleship USS New Mexico. The attack was a reminder that even 36 days into the Iwo operation, Japanese forces could still strike American ships. Spruance supervised the transfer of his staff and equipment with characteristic calm, refusing to show emotion about the attack, even as his flagship limped toward Pearl Harbor for repairs. The Indianapolis would sink 4 months later with enormous loss of life after delivering atomic bomb components to Tinian, but that tragedy lay in the unforeseeable future. In March 1945, Spruance simply moved to a new flagship and continued directing operations. Iwo Jima was finally declared secure on March 26, though scattered Japanese resistance continued for months. The final accounting was brutal: 26,000 American casualties, including 6,800 killed in action. Japanese defenders, 21,000 dead, 1,083 captured, virtually every defender killed or captured because surrender was not culturally acceptable. The casualty ratio was nearly 1-to-1, far worse than the Marshalls or even Tarawa, reflecting Japanese defensive sophistication and American lack of alternatives to frontal assault. The island was secured. B-29 crews had their emergency landing field, but the cost shocked American public opinion and raised ominous questions about casualties for the planned invasion of Japan itself. Before Iwo Jima was even secured, Spruance was already directing the next operation, Okinawa, scheduled for April 1st. Okinawa was vastly larger than Iwo Jima, defended by 110,000 Japanese troops, close enough to Japan that land-based air could support defensive operations continuously. The operation would require over 1,500 ships, 550,000 personnel, months of sustained combat. It would also face a new Japanese defensive tactic: massive kamikaze attacks, suicide aircraft deliberately crashing into American ships, trading one pilot and one plane for potential sinking of carriers or battleships. The mathematics of kamikaze warfare were different from conventional combat, required different defensive measures, produced different casualty patterns. Spruance would have to adapt doctrine to counter threats that hadn't existed in earlier operations. April 1st, 1945, L-Day at Okinawa. 4 divisions of Army and Marine forces landed on the western coast of the island, initially facing light resistance that made commanders briefly optimistic. Within days, optimism evaporated. Japanese defenders had withdrawn to prepared positions in the island's southern hills, creating defensive lines that would require months to break. Simultaneously, Japan launched Operation Kikusuai, coordinated kamikaze attacks using hundreds of suicide aircraft against the American fleet. April 6th and 7 brought 355 kamikaze attacks in 48 hours, the largest coordinated aerial suicide assault in history. American defenders shot down most attackers, but enough penetrated to sink 6 ships and damage another 20 in 2 days. Spruance watched from New Mexico's Flag Bridge as suicide aircraft dove through anti-aircraft fire, some exploding in midair, others striking ships with devastating effect. The Okinawa campaign became a test of endurance as much as tactics. Japanese defenders fought from fortified caves and tunnels, requiring the same slow reduction tactics that proved so costly at Iwo Jima. Kamikaze attacks continued through April and May, totaling over 1,900 suicide sorties by campaign's end, sinking 36 American ships, damaging 368 others. American casualties mounted steadily. By May, over 10,000 dead. By June, over 20,000. The operation continued for 82 days, the longest sustained campaign in the Pacific War, and Spruance commanded Fifth Fleet throughout, spending over 240 consecutive days at sea, including the Iwo Jima operation. The physical and mental strain was enormous, visible in his increasingly gaunt appearance, but he never requested relief, never suggested rotating to shore duty. June 22, 1945, Okinawa declared secure after 3 months of continuous combat. Final casualties: 50,000 American casualties, including 12,500 killed in action. Japanese military casualties: 110,000 dead, 7,000 captured. Civilian casualties: estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead, many from suicides encouraged by Japanese military propaganda. The campaign had been the bloodiest in the Pacific War, casualty rates exceeding even the worst predictions. Spruance prepared his after-action reports with exhausted precision, documenting what worked and what didn't. But the fundamental reality was unavoidable. When American forces faced prepared Japanese defenses on significant land masses, casualties would be catastrophic regardless of planning sophistication. Mathematics could optimize tactics, but couldn't overcome strategic realities of defense in depth against an enemy refusing surrender. July 1945, Pearl Harbor. Spruance was finally relieved of command after 8 months of continuous operations, the longest sustained combat command in American naval history. He had lost weight, his face showed deep lines of fatigue. Staff officers noted his unusual irritability during the final weeks. But he had completed his mission, seen Iwo Jima and Okinawa through to conclusion, provided the bases necessary for strategic bombing of Japan and staging for the planned invasion. The cost had been enormous, over 75,000 American casualties in 2 operations, but the strategic objectives were achieved. What Spruance didn't know as he finally returned to shore was that the invasion he was planning would never happen. That atomic weapons would render months of planning irrelevant, that the grinding endgame he had endured was approaching an end none of the planners anticipated. The mathematics of warfare was about to be revolutionized by physics in ways even Spruance's analytical mind couldn't have predicted. July 28, 1945, CINCPAC headquarters, Makalapa Hill. Raymond Spruance sits in a planning conference room with 40 other officers, all studying maps of Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese home island. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan, is scheduled for November 1st, just 95 days away. The planning documents spread across tables run to thousands of pages. Assault force composition, naval gunfire allocations, air support schedules, logistics chains, casualty projections. Spruance reads the casualty estimates with grim understanding. Conservative projections: 400,000 American casualties in the first phase alone. Optimistic projections: 250,000. Worst case: over 1 million. The numbers are unprecedented in American military history. They are also mathematically derived from Okinawa casualty rates applied to operations on far larger scale against far larger defending forces. Spruance's job is to plan naval support for an invasion that will make Okinawa look modest by comparison. Operation Downfall, the overall plan for invading Japan, consisted of two major phases. Olympic would assault Kyushu in November 1945, with 14 divisions, approximately 767,000 troops, supported by over 1,000 ships including 42 carriers. Coronet would assault Honshu near Tokyo in March 1946 with an additional 25 divisions, the largest amphibious operation in human history. The forces allocated exceeded everything committed to Europe, including Normandy. The planning staffs were larger than most headquarters, required coordination between Navy, Army Air Force, British Empire forces, all working toward integrated operational plans that would, if executed, dwarf every previous military operation. GDP is available in the 93 bills. If you hadn't worked to decide whether or not it's 1940, the economic devastation required T-side, diversified contacts. To disappear 500 years in Academy set of cancel, the panic staffs are favorably making subtle detection. Spruance's specific responsibility was planning naval operations for Olympic, preliminary bombardment schedules, fire support coordination, anti-kamikaze defense, logistic support for sustained operations against an enemy defending their homeland. The challenges exceeded anything faced at Okinawa. Intelligence estimated Japan had 10,000 aircraft available for kamikaze attacks, could sustain operations at intensities that would overwhelm American defenses eventually. Naval planners calculated that 30 to 40 ships would be sunk, perhaps 200 damaged, in the first phase alone. Those losses were deemed acceptable for achieving strategic objectives, but they represented more ships than America lost in the entire Pacific War to that point. The mathematics of Olympic were brutal. Overwhelming American superiority in resources applied against Japanese willingness to accept total death. The casualty projections haunted every planning session. Spruance had seen Iwo Jima and Okinawa, understood viscerally what defending Japanese forces could accomplish even when outnumbered and outgunned. Kyushu would be defended by over 500,000 Japanese troops, millions of civilians mobilized into militia units, every beach fortified, every approach mined, an entire society prepared for apocalyptic resistance. American forces would achieve victory eventually through sheer resource superiority, but the cost would exceed anything experienced in the war. Spruance calculated and recalculated, looking for planning innovations that might reduce casualties, knowing that ultimately the mathematics permitted only marginal improvements. This was attritional warfare at its most brutal, unavoidable strategic necessity produced by an enemy refusing any outcome except total defense or total victory. August 6, 1945, changed everything, although Spruance didn't immediately understand the implications. News arrived that an atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, a city of 340,000 inhabitants, killed at least 70,000 immediately with a single weapon. The announcement was vague about technical details, described the weapon as using atomic power without explaining what that meant. Spruance's first reaction was relief mixed with uncertainty. If one weapon could destroy a city, perhaps the invasion could be avoided. Perhaps Japan would surrender rather than face atomic bombardment. But he also wondered about the weapon's implications for naval warfare, whether ships could defend against atomic attack, what the weapon meant for the planning he devoted months to completing. August 9th brought news of a second atomic bomb, this time destroying Nagasaki, another city vaporized in an instant. Japanese government communications intercepted by American code breakers showed confusion and panic, debate about surrender terms, recognition that conventional defense couldn't protect cities from atomic attack. August 10th brought Japanese surrender offer, conditional on retaining the emperor. American government response was swift, unconditional surrender or additional atomic attacks. August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's radio address announced Japanese surrender, the first time most Japanese citizens had heard their emperor's voice. The Pacific War was over. The invasion Spruance had spent months planning would never happen. Spruance's reaction to Japan's surrender was complex and characteristically understated. He felt enormous relief that the invasion was unnecessary, that hundreds of thousands of American lives were saved, that the grinding endgame was finally ending. But he also felt profound uncertainty about what atomic weapons meant for naval warfare and military planning generally. He had spent his career calculating optimal strategies using conventional weapons with predictable effects. Atomic weapons introduced variables that resisted calculation, weapons of absolute destruction, city-killing power in single bombs, strategic effects that made conventional military operations potentially irrelevant. The mathematics he relied on for planning required understanding weapon effects, casualty probabilities, resource requirements. Atomic weapons made much of that mathematics obsolete. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Admiral Halsey's flagship, serves as the site for formal Japanese surrender ceremonies. Spruance is present but deliberately stays in the background, not signing documents, not standing near MacArthur or Nimitz during the ceremony. He watches Japanese officials sign surrender instruments, officially ending the war, and feels mostly exhaustion. The war he planned operations for, calculated logistics for, is finally over. But the victory feels incomplete somehow. He had prepared for an invasion that required every skill he possessed, every lesson learned from 4 years of Pacific operations. The atomic bombs prevented that invasion, saved countless lives, but also rendered his planning irrelevant. The quiet man who won through calculation was facing the reality that some problems could be solved through physics rather than tactics, that the warfare he understood was becoming obsolete even as victory was achieved. October 1945, Spruance received orders for his next assignment. Commander 5th Fleet was to be disestablished with war's end, replaced by peacetime administrative commands. He would be offered multiple positions, all prestigious, none involving operational command. The Navy was transitioning to peace, and Spruance's particular skills were less valued in peacetime administration than wartime operations. He accepted appointment as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, a staff position coordinating occupation forces in Japan and demobilization of wartime forces. It was important work, but fundamentally administrative. The intellectual challenge of operational planning, the mathematical problems of logistics and tactics, the satisfaction of seeing calculations prove correct in actual operations, those were ending as wartime commands were dissolved. In later years, when asked about the atomic bombs and the invasion that never happened, Spruance would give characteristically brief answers. He said he was grateful the invasion proved unnecessary, that American casualties were avoided, that Japan surrendered without requiring the slaughter he had calculated would be inevitable. But he never discussed publicly whether the atomic bombs were morally justified, whether alternative paths to victory existed, whether the projected casualty figures were accurate or inflated to justify using the weapons. Those questions were beyond his expertise, as he saw it. He was a naval officer, not a moral philosopher or nuclear physicist. His job had been planning operations using available weapons to achieve strategic objectives with minimum friendly casualties. The atomic bombs achieved those objectives more effectively than conventional invasion could have. The mathematics said the decision was optimal even if the moral implications remained troubling. The quiet man who calculated risks throughout the Pacific War maintained his characteristic silence about the greatest risk of all, the one he never had to calculate because physics provided a different solution than tactics could offer. February 13, 1969. Pebble Beach, California. Raymond Ames Spruance dies at age 83 from complications of cerebrovascular disease, passing quietly in his sleep, the same way he lived his life, without drama or public display. The obituaries in major newspapers are respectful but brief. A few paragraphs noting his role at Midway, his commands in the Central Pacific, his later service as president of the Naval War College, and ambassador to the Philippines. The coverage is modest compared to the elaborate tributes given to Admiral Halsey when he died 10 years earlier. Most Americans reading about Spruance's death don't recognize his name, don't understand his significance, don't realize they're reading about one of the most consequential military commanders in American history. The quiet man remained quiet even in death. his legacy obscured by more flamboyant figures who dominated public memory of the Pacific War. But within the Navy, particularly among officers who studied carrier warfare and amphibious operations, Spruance's reputation was undergoing gradual reassessment. The immediate post-war period had favored aggressive admirals like Halsey, whose fighting spirit matched cultural narratives about American victory. By the 1960s, military historians were examining battles more analytically, questioning whether aggressive tactics actually produced better strategic results than calculated restraint. The Battle of the Philippine Sea received particular scrutiny. Initial criticism of Spruance's defensive positioning was giving way to recognition that his decisions were strategically sound, even if tactically frustrating. He destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force while protecting the Saipan invasion. Halsey's aggressive pursuit at Leyte Gulf, by contrast, nearly resulted in disaster. The comparison suggested that calculated risk sometimes achieved more than aggressive action. Spruance's combat record was unprecedented when examined objectively. At Midway, he won the most decisive carrier battle in history, commanding carriers for the first time. At the Philippine Sea, he destroyed 600 Japanese aircraft and 3 carriers while losing minimal forces. His amphibious operations from the Marshalls through Okinawa demonstrated systematic learning and operational refinement that minimized casualties within the brutal constraints of island assault. His overall combat record never lost a ship under his command until Indianapolis was torpedoed after he'd transferred off. Never sustained a tactical defeat. Commanded the largest naval forces in American history with minimal losses. Developed amphibious doctrine that became standard for the rest of the war. The statistical record suggested exceptional command ability even if popular memory didn't recognize it. The Naval War College, where Spruance's intellectual development began in the 1920s, made his Midway decisions central to curriculum on carrier warfare and calculated risk. Every class of naval officers studied his decision to launch early with incomplete intelligence, his afternoon restraint refusing to pursue into night action, his balance between aggression and defense. The case study examined not just what Spruance did, but how he thought, the analytical framework that allowed him to make correct decisions under impossible pressure. Faculty emphasized that modern warfare required intellectual preparation at least as much as fighting spirit, that officers who could calculate probability and optimize within constraints achieved better results than officers who relied on courage and intuition alone. Admiral Nimitz's assessment of Spruance, written in 1946 and declassified in the 1960s, provided the most authoritative evaluation. Spruance is one of the greatest fighting and thinking admirals in American naval history. His victories at Midway and Philippine Sea changed the strategic balance in the Pacific decisively. His amphibious operations from the Gilberts through Okinawa demonstrated operational excellence sustained across 2 years of continuous combat. His greatest quality was the intellectual courage to make decisions based on mathematical calculation rather than emotional impulse, to accept calculated risk while refusing reckless exposure, to protect victory even when aggressive pursuit seemed tempting. The Pacific War was won by many factors, but Spruance's command ability ranks among the most important. The question of why Spruance remained relatively unknown publicly fascinated military historians. Part of the answer was his personality. He actively avoided publicity, refused interviews, never cultivated the media relationships that made Halsey and MacArthur household names. But the deeper reason was cultural. American society celebrated visible courage and aggressive action, the warrior virtues exemplified by Halsey's fighting spirit. Spruance's quiet calculation, his mathematical restraint, his preference for strategic security over tactical glory, these didn't fit comfortable narratives about military heroism. He was too cerebral, too analytical, too willing to accept limited victory rather than gamble for total triumph. Those qualities made him exceptional as a naval commander, but unsuitable as a public hero. Modern naval strategists studying 21st century warfare found Spruance's approach increasingly relevant. Modern carrier operations involve complex calculations of range, timing, defensive positioning, risk assessment under uncertainty. Aggressive instinct alone proves insufficient for operations involving multiple carrier groups, hundreds of aircraft, coordination across thousands of miles. Spruance's analytical framework: calculate optimal positions, accept calculated risk, protect striking power for sustained operations, remained applicable to warfare whose technological parameters had changed, but whose geometric and probabilistic foundations remained similar. The quiet man's mathematics translated across generations because the mathematics of naval warfare retained fundamental continuity despite technological change. By the 21st century, military historians were ranking Spruance among America's greatest admirals, often ahead of more famous figures. His combat record, when examined without emotional bias toward aggressive action, demonstrated consistent excellence across diverse operations. He proved himself as tactical commander at Midway, strategic planner in developing the Central Pacific Offensive, operational commander during amphibious assaults, fleet commander managing the largest naval forces in history. The versatility suggested comprehensive mastery of naval warfare at every level, from tactical engagement to strategic planning. Few American admirals demonstrated such range of capabilities. The central lesson of Spruance's career transcended his specific decisions and became a broader principle about military leadership. Revolutionary effectiveness can come from unexpected sources, from officers who don't fit conventional profiles of military heroism, from intellectual preparation rather than fighting spirit alone. The Naval Academy still produced aggressive warriors, but it also needed analytical thinkers, officers who could optimize complex systems, commanders who measured risk mathematically rather than emotionally. Spruance proved both types could succeed, that diversity of approach strengthened military institutions, that the best leadership sometimes came from those least recognized by popular culture. The final assessment of Raymond Spruance must acknowledge both his achievements and his limitations. He won decisive battles through superior calculation and strategic insight. He developed amphibious doctrine that saved countless lives. He commanded with restraint that protected American forces while achieving strategic objectives. But he also made errors. Tarawa's inadequate planning resulted in unnecessary casualties. His Philippine Sea positioning allowed some Japanese forces to escape. His personality made it difficult for subordinates to challenge his decisions. He was not perfect, not infallible, not immune to the uncertainties that made warfare unpredictable. But his achievements far exceeded his limitations, and his influence on American naval warfare extended long after his death. Standing in the shadows of American military history, Raymond Spruance represents something important: the triumph of intellect over instinct, calculation over courage, strategic wisdom over tactical glory. He proved that the most important battles are sometimes won in planning rooms months before combat begins, that restraint can achieve more than aggression, that protecting victory matters as much as achieving it. The quiet man who won through mathematics left a legacy that transcends individual battles, a demonstration that military excellence comes in many forms, that the heroes who shaped history aren't always the ones celebrated in newspapers. His story deserves remembering precisely because it contradicts comfortable narratives about warfare, offers an alternative model of leadership based on analytical thinking rather than fighting spirit, proves that sometimes the most revolutionary commander is the one almost no one notices until historians study the actual record. Raymond Spruance won the Pacific War as much as any single individual, and he did it while remaining virtually invisible to the public he served. That combination of decisive achievement and quiet modesty makes him perhaps the most important unrecognized hero in American military history.